So, my story begins roughly a year and some change after the field incident. We'd chosen this particular duplex because it was cheap, $650 a month, and it had the space that we needed. Like a lot of structures of this sort, it could have passed for a normal house as it had 2 levels that we had full access to. The house itself was built around 1911 and was showing its age in some ways, but was otherwise fairly suitable. Minus the roach infestation that we had going on thanks to our neighbors, which, as we would find out after they moved out in the middle of the night, was caused by neglecting the children and a general lack of ever cleaning. The smell coming out of that house was palpable even from a distance. We were barely into our first night in our new home when it became obvious that something was off. First came the face peeking into one of the upstairs windows as I was unpacking by myself. To this day, I'm genuinely surprised that I didn't leave a trail of pee behind me after my brain processed that I was being watched by a man who most certainly should have been where he was, either alive or dead. I quickly ran and told my ex's father, who had come up from Alabama to help us with the move, and naturally by the time that he got to the room, the face was gone and left me looking stupid. But this would go on to become a reoccurring theme during our first few months on the property. At first, he said that I must have seen my own reflection, but A, I didn't scare easily, and B, I know what my face looks like, and it certainly wasn't mine. The other theory was that it must have been the teenage boy who lived in the other half who climbed onto the roof of the lower add-on, hoping to see some girl-on-girl action or something. The only issue was that the entire family was black, I'm Mexican, and the face that I saw was pale and vaguely see-through. So, unless the peeper was also wearing a full face of makeup and hoop earrings, I don't know, it just doesn't make any sense. The next few days of settling in were fairly uneventful though. It wasn't until a week later when we were watching a show in our upstairs bedroom that we noticed our 2 cats were sitting on the landing looking down at something intently. Of course, we dismissed it as weird cat behavior, until we heard a very audible, very distinct feminine voice go, meow meow, from the bottom of the steps. It was almost as though whoever or whatever was trying to get their attention. Of course, we both immediately froze. I mean, it was just us in the house at that point. Well, it should have been. And while it was certainly creepy, we took it as a good sign that the cats weren't hissing or poofing up at this entity, and we just kind of wrote it off as weird and possibly a shared overactive imagination. And it wasn't until my ex had to use the bathroom, which was unfortunately downstairs, that things sort of escalated into, well, downright scary. Once she came back to bed, she told me that as she was coming back, she saw a male face peering in our middle room window. The only issue was that this window was 8 feet off the ground and also had a large AC unit in it that would have prevented anyone from pressing their face against the glass panes like that. After that night, weird yet random things would happen, such as unexplainable thumps and a horrible sense of foreboding in both the kitchen and the back room where I first saw the face. This feeling of dread only really happened at night, with it being the most intense in the kitchen if one went for a late-night snack. I often joked that the spirit was judging us for eating so late, but as I found out later, a previous female tenant had apparently died suddenly in there. And once I knew that, it all sort of made a bit more sense. Eventually, we contacted 2 separate paranormal investigation groups. The first ones who came through didn't experience anything, earth-shattering at least, nothing enough to do anything about, and despite having the entities directly answer my questions through a spirit box or whatever they're called, concluded that it was more than likely just our imaginations. The second group wasn't much different, coming to the conclusion that my service related to PTSD was making me paranoid. Mind you, this was after we all witnessed one of those screw-top flashlights being turned on and off by itself whenever one of the investigators asked it to, along with a few floating entities being caught on a Kinect camera and being fairly interactive with all of them. It wasn't though until our neighbors abandoned their side of the duplex in the middle of the night that it all began to make a lot more sense. Once the owners began doing a deep clean and tossing out everything, I noticed a Ouija board sticking out of one of the trash bags that they'd left on the front porch. And, unsurprisingly, once the board had been removed from the property, activity slowed down considerably, save for some random pounding on their side of the wall at all hours of the night, and the silhouette of a man staring down at you from their upstairs window. That and cabinet doors in our kitchen randomly flying open, which got really annoying after a while. However, these occurrences were all fairly rare for the next 2 years. That was until we broke up and I was left alone with the cats to use as explanations for weird noises. At which point, it all became more terrifying than it had ever been. Hoof steps and banging on the roof were common. A very heavy and sickening presence throughout the entire house was the most disturbing. More thumping on the walls. A friend who stayed over one night reported to see a figure hovering in one of the corners of the living room, his eyes glowing as he looked down at us. And after enduring all of this for nearly 2 months, I was incredibly thankful to leave when I'd found another place to rent. I must say though, I feel pretty bad for whoever lives there next. My husband and I have been together since we were 16. We're now 24 with 2 kids, and this all started before I met him. His stepmom came into the picture when he was around 13 and brought with her what my husband described as a satanic book. It gave everyone the creeps, and my significant other's dad decided to burn it, which resulted in ear-piercing screams when it hit the fire, apparently. After that, they started experiencing strange activity, such as items being moved. The most unexplainable was a laundry hamper that was found on the top of their roof. His sister also had an experience being woken up to a black figure hovering over her, choking her. Her boyfriend at the time witnessed this too. When my husband and I got together, I spent many nights with him, but whenever I did, I always had a bad feeling over there. But what changed me from a skeptic to a believer was when I placed my phone on the TV stand, and not even a minute later, my significant other and I watched my phone fall from the ceiling in the corner of the room. Anyway, we moved into our first apartment together in 2018. Whatever it was followed us, and the activity went from sparse to almost daily. Unexplained footsteps, items not being where they should be, cabinets opening and slamming shut, doors opening and closing. We moved in 2019 and we were followed by whatever this was again. Nothing about the type of activity changed, but this is when it started showing itself to us. The first time, my husband and I were relaxing on the couch, which faced towards our dining area. The kitchen was behind the wall of where we had our TV set up, and I'm really not sure what compelled me to stop our conversation and look in that direction, but what I saw chills me to this day. Peeking out from behind the wall that separates the living room and the kitchen was a shadow figure of a tall man. It stayed long enough for me to get a really good look at it too, and know without a doubt that it wasn't my imagination. As soon as if it noticed that I saw it, it pulled itself back behind the wall though. During that moment, I was more curious than afraid, and I pursued it in fact. But when I got around the corner, there was nothing in the kitchen. When I think about it now, I wonder just how many times this thing was spying on us in fact. And also, why would it pull itself back into the kitchen instead of disappear right there? Did it want me to follow it? In any case, shortly after this incident, my daughter was born. The activity, unfortunately, got worse again. It became a nightly occurrence that her door would open by itself. This also happened during her naps even. Not only was my husband now seeing this figure too, but it also started touching us and even being vocal. One night, while laying in bed, I dropped my phone off the bed, and while leaning down to grab it, I felt a hand stroke my arm. I'd also often feel like my husband was getting into bed with me and hear breathing in my ear. only to roll over to find myself alone. My husband, he also had his foot grabbed one night while playing video games. Night was when most of the activity happened. Our daughter was waking up screaming over 20 times a night. Her doctor said that it was the worst sleep regression that she's ever heard of. We moved again, though, in 2021. Our very first night being there, I was unpacking in the kitchen while my husband was putting our daughter down for bed. I turned around to see a huge shadow of a man go from one end of the kitchen to the other and disappear. Another night, we were woken up to banging on our walls, which faded out into tapping. This was a wall that separated our room from our daughter's room. My husband decided to tap back at that point, and the tapping would repeat every pattern that my husband did. We let our daughter sleep in our room that night, and when we woke her up, she pointed to the doorway and told us that there was a man there. We moved again in 2022, our current residence, and I'm not sure what has changed, but the activity comes and goes now. Sometimes there will be very little activity for months, and then it's a sort of rush of seeing figures, doors opening and closing in front of us, etc. I can say that this activity does pick up during stressful times. Our daughter is now 4 and will occasionally bring up the shadow that visits during the night. It's never harmed us, which I'm thankful for, and we've lived with this for so long that it's more like a noisy roommate at this point. But my question is, do we continue to coexist, or should we get answers and try to remove it? Should we ignore it, or should we do something about it? What do you think? I, a 28-year-old female, am a dog walker or pet sitter. Some of the dogs that I walk have reactivity, as did this one dog, a pit lab mix. She used to be a bad puller, along with being incredibly reactive to other dogs on leashes as soon as she'd see them. Through lots of work and training with her, she's come a long way with her reactivity to the point that it really is not an issue anymore, even when another owner's carelessness allows their dogs to get too close for comfort. Now, on this one walk, she was a dream the whole time. Past multiple dogs without issue, she would just look at me for her treat. She knew that she would get if she was good. We turned down a side street, though, that looked completely vacant at the time, so I could give her some more relaxed walking time, and all went well for a while. Not a soul in sight, until there was. Now, while I'm usually very good at keeping my head on a swivel, as some of my walks are not in the safest areas of the city, this guy definitely took me by surprise. I really don't know how he did it too, but he got about 2 to 3 feet behind us without my dog or me knowing that he was even there, and all of a sudden shouted something unintelligibly. I could really only make out the last 2 words, "your dog." Immediately, though, my dog, with no prior history of human reactivity, got between us and started growling, snapping and lunging aggressively at this guy. I'm a smaller woman at 5'3", and this guy was at least 6'7", and incredibly muscular. As soon as he saw my dog trying to attack him, and me struggling to hold her back, he threw his arms up and bolted across the street without another word. He disappeared shortly after, around a corner. I have never praised a dog for reactivity like that, until that very moment. I gave her all the treats that I had left in my pocket, took her home and told her owner what had just happened and how her dog might have just saved my life. Of course, I hope that I'm wrong and the guy was just slow with social cues, but either the dog or I got that impression. Needless to say, she is by far my favorite client dog. I go on walks with her still every week, but we haven't gone down the street again while there are no people about. I am beyond blessed to have her and get to walk her weekly, but I do hope that I never see that guy again. This happened 7 years ago when I was just a little bit more naive and 30 pounds lighter. Still just as short though. It was a week before Christmas and I was finishing up shopping or something. My mother, aunt, and Nana are all big into lottery, so I tend to get some scratch tickets and season tickets as gifts. I don't gamble really, so it's my one time buying them in a year. I always go to the same place too, down the street from me, and I wouldn't say that I live anywhere dangerous by any means. Not gated community level, but like a solid children can walk around alone in the dusk out of 10 sort of thing. Now, I had an old SAAB that was the classic, no one can drive her but me level of finicky. Sometimes she just wouldn't start unless you held the brake and sort of shifted through the gears a bit, went to park, pushed really hard, and then turned the key. It took forever to figure that special secret handshake out, by the way. The roof needed to be manually put up, like it fell on your head sometimes, if you put it down. Not a design feature. And just a lot of sort of wonky stuff, I guess. My brother, who is a lunatic with toxic rage issues, but that's a whole different story, had broken the handle on my passenger side door right before this, after picking him up from scaring children at the hospital, so you couldn't open that door at all anymore. To get to the passenger side, you were either Dukes of Hazzarding it, or you'd have to go through my side. So it's Christmassy, a bit of snow and sludge, but pretty normal day. I go to the gas station to get the tickets, cash only, so enough money to make my purchases in hand. There are a few people behind me in line and a few playing Keno in the sitting area. There's also one wiry guy behind me to the side in line, but I didn't notice much other than that he was a little closer than I would personally have liked. In any case, I make my purchases, several $20 scratch tickets. They don't want anything less, bad odds apparently. Anyway, a couple of year-long season tickets and everything adds up to just over $400. Ouch. I pay the cashier and I head out to my janky little SAAB. I sit down, close my door, don't lock it, and begin to count, or sort of organize my change and everything. When not even 35 seconds later, the wiry man comes out, walks to my car, and as he does, he stalls just for a second and tries my passenger side handle. It doesn't work and just makes a clunk as the handle is sort of free-moving and doesn't connect to any mechanical stuff at this point. But my heart dropped and my stomach got really sour. My body knew to panic, but my head hadn't caught up yet. He immediately keeps going, walking out of the parking lot and down the sidewalk. And it wasn't until I thought about it later and told some people that I really didn't even consider that the man was probably going to try and rob me, or maybe even worse. I now very religiously follow the 45-second rule, and I am a lot more vigilant during Christmas shopping. I've had several paranormal experiences in my lifetime, both personally and professionally, but I'm going to discuss the professional paranormal experiences at this point. Now, I was a surgical technologist in labor and delivery for about 10 years. I worked for a non-for-profit Catholic hospital for almost 4 years out of that 10. When I first started in the department, the two techs that had already worked there for a very long time, their names are M and J, and myself K, told me stories about Sister Mary Margaret, who apparently was a surgery tech back when the hospital was still run by nuns. Needless to say, Sister Mary Margaret was very much by the book and left little room for her co-workers' errors. Jay knew about Sister Mary Margaret, but Em had worked there for so long that she actually worked with the nun. Em began to tell tales about instances when she'd heard Sister Mary Margaret in the OR suite long after she passed away, and up to the current time frame. Being a born skeptic, I thought Em and Jay were just hazing the new girl. I wasn't buying a bit of their nonsense. Well, fast forward to when I'm off of orientation and working my 12-hour night shifts. I'd been in the back setting up the OR suite or stocking supplies, and I could hear the shuffle of shoe covers, just as high heels make that sort of clack-clack sound. There is a very distinct sound that shoe covers make when they shuffle along the hospital floor like that. I just sleuthed it out of there though, and I figured that M and or J put one of the night shift nurses up to pranking me just to see if I'd fall for it. And well, I just had to hop out of there, catch them in the act, and let them know that they weren't fooling anybody. So I popped out into the hallway, ready to scare the scrub pants off of whoever was pranking me, but when I jumped out into the hallway, nobody was there. There was no movement in the hallway, swinging of the doors, chatter on the intercoms, nothing. I was really perplexed by that initially. But being the first incident, I just kind of shrugged it off and I just went on working. As time passed though, these incidents became more and more frequent. We had more new employees and M&J were training them. Me and her new orientee had an incident where sterile supplies were on the OR bed and a bulb syringe floated from the top of the supply pile at a 90-degree angle for about a minute and then just dropped to the floor. I really began believing them too when they relayed that story to me during report. I could tell that they were both honestly shaken up by the ordeal, and I actually felt pretty bad for them. They were scared, and trust me, these two were not actresses by any means. There was no way that they could have given such an Oscar-worthy performance like that. In any case, I continued having my own encounters with shuffling shoe covers, unintelligible whispering, all of the hallmarks of a typical haunting. Some of my tech co-workers continued reporting the same kind of activity. None of the activity was as egregious as what Em and her orientee experienced with the floating bulb syringe in midair. But then it all stopped being amusing to me when I went to the OR suite at about 2:30 or 3 in the morning to stock linens and sterile water and saline into the warmer. I'd done this 100 times before. It wasn't anything new by any means. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with hospital warmers, they are the equivalent to leaving the hospital and going straight to Narnia. These miraculous inventions are what makes your hospital blankets so nice and toasty. We also put sterile water and saline in the top portion of the warmer to heat up liquids used externally so the patient doesn't get hypothermic. To give you a visual, it literally looks like an industrial-sized stainless steel refrigerator, I guess. It performs in the same way, except instead of making everything cold, it warms everything up, thus the hospital warmer. So I had taken the linen cart and some water and saline bottles with me to stock up everything. I left the cart in the hallway outside of our 2 surgical suites. The warmer was in between both OR suites and a little cubby besides our crash cart. And as you probably very well know, hospitals are known for migraine-inducing bright lights. This was one of a few things that I disliked about working in a hospital, in fact. Whenever I was able, I'd spare the blinding fluorescent lights as much as possible. So I proceeded to stock the warmer without turning lights on to spare myself the glare whenever I could. The OR suites were darkened and shadowy, but I could easily see to get around. I'm sure everybody familiar with refrigerators or freezers already is aware that the refrigerator part is pretty cold and the freezer part is obviously frozen cold. Well, the warmers at the hospital basically work on the same premise. The refrigerator part warms the blankets, while the freezer part makes the external water and saline bottles really toasty. That's exactly what we want there too. So I open the refrigerator part and expect to be hit in the face with some pretty arid heat, but it was cold. Was it broken? Ugh, it has to be. There's no way that this warmer could be this cold. Something obviously isn't right. Then I also checked the freezer portion, which should have been even hotter, but it was actually colder. That wasn't right. It was not normal for this warmer to be this cold. The fans were blowing warm air, but it just wasn't warming anything up. And all of a sudden, it was then that I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I have never felt that way at the job previously or ever since. So I turned around and looked up to see what I can only describe as a black mist or smoke towards the top of the ceiling. At first, I thought that maybe some part of the warmer's electric had fizzled out and this was the beginning of a fire. The problem was, the black mist or smoke was on the ceiling and in the opposite corner of the room. I looked at the warmer's connections and everything was as it was supposed to be. There was nothing wrong with the warmer, it seemed. But there was something in that OR suite cubby that was not friendly, and it seemed rather malevolent. I knew then and there that this wasn't what the other girls described. This wasn't Sister Mary Margaret. She would never do anything menacing like this. Well, at least not based on the stories that I had heard. I can't explain how, but I knew not only that it wasn't her, but I also knew that she wasn't there to help protect me from whatever the heck this was. I watched as it slowly began to seep down from the corner of the ceiling towards myself and the warmer. I did what seemed to be the most sensible thing, and I just began reciting the Lord's Prayer. And it paused, full stop. As I continued, it literally looked like a film being played in reverse. It slinked back to the corner that it came from, and as soon as it did, it was just gone. Like it just disappeared before my eyes. I turned to hustle out of that little cubby area and back into the hallway. I happened to notice, when I turned around to face the warmer, that it was back to its normally toasty temperature as well. I didn't ruminate on it too long. I just booked it out of the OR suite to the hallway, and I went back to the nurse's station. Now, I, until this very story, never said a thing to anyone about anything like this. I didn't mention my experience to coworkers, friends, or family. I honestly just didn't want to be ridiculed. But I just feel that this story, I'm no longer compelled to keep it to myself. There's really no harm in sharing it now, and I just really feel like getting it off my chest because the whole thing, I just feel really scared. When I was a kid, no older than 10, I was walking to the mailbox to get the mail from my parents' place, and I was fully clad in my baseball uniform, ready to go, when a car pulled over and an elderly woman urged me to get into the car. Immediately, I obviously knew that something was off, but they said, "Come on, we're going to be late." She insisted. She went on saying things like my bat and glove were in the trunk, telling me that my dad had given it to them. She said that my dad couldn't take me anymore, so he asked them to take me and that they lived nearby. I honestly don't really remember what I did. I just remember the anxiety of piecing together what was happening. I want to say that I booked it and ran for the house, but as I've gotten older, I don't even remember anymore. All I remember is being back at my house, and the creepy old lady ended up ringing the doorbell. When my dad answered, he was obviously confused, and she told him that they were testing me to see if I would jump into the car. The most unsettling thing to me is that I don't remember if I actually got in their car. I'm not particularly old, but the experience pumped so much adrenaline in me that I just really don't remember it well. When I try to remember, I can picture both outcomes of me running home and me in their car. I just don't remember getting a scolding, so I tend to assume the former occurred, but I'm still not sure. Testing children or not, it was a messed up thing to do in your free time. It makes me wonder if this couple actually had the intentions that they spoke of. I remember getting home and not saying a word to my parents. The shock was still fresh, and I had no time to process what had just happened. Was ringing the doorbell afterwards some kind of cover-up for a failed attempt to avoid being reported to the police? I still don't know, but I'm wondering if anybody else has ever encountered something similar. I just find the whole situation extremely off-putting. I mean, you don't really find too many kids walking around alone in a baseball uniform, and coming up with that sort of stuff on the fly just gives me the impression that it was not that lady's first time trying to coax a kid into her car. So my family and I live in Mississippi, and my husband and I are truck drivers, and he's just accepted a job where he's getting trained in Atlanta, GA. And we just drove out there today. I dropped him off, and then I drove 6.5 hours back home. I don't get home till 1:30 in the morning, and I've got to work tomorrow or later today. So I'm in the bath when I see my husband, clear as day, out of the corner of my eye, standing at the door in his underwear, smirking at me, like he's had a bad joke that he can't wait to tell me. Now, normally I'm pretty jumpy and he likes to scare me, but this was definitely not normal. I mean, you normally hear my family being visited by dead relatives, but my husband is alive and well. In any case, I turned around, and when I did, there was nobody there. I called him about the encounter, and he made jokes about it. But could this be something evil trying to mess with me? The thing, or whatever it was, disappeared when I got scared and jumped out of my skin. I shared this because I was really tired, and when I get tired, I get a bit paranoid. I had been running on 20 plus hours since I last slept, and I haven't exactly been sleeping well for the last week. I have a son that is less than a year old too, who still gets scared, and when he wakes up, I'm really just not there, so he'll cry out, and I'll have to wake up and put him back to sleep. I know it probably all seems a bit silly. I mean, chances are is that I was just tired, and I mistook the shower curtain for my husband or something. But I don't know, it seemed so clear at the time, like there was actually somebody there, and when I rethink about it, it just really doesn't add up as to me just hallucinating or something. Plus, this has never really happened to me before, so maybe I'm just going mad right now or something, but I suspect not. In any case, thanks for listening, and if it happens again, I'll be sure to let you guys know. He is hoping, though, that it doesn't. I was with two of my friends that night when it happened. I was driving them home because I was the only one who didn't drink at the party that we attended earlier in the evening. We were on the road when my friend Alex felt sick, so I decided to park the car a few minutes on the side road and wait for him to get better. I remember it though. It was a clear night because of the full moon high in the sky, and the landscape was beautiful. The beach was close to the road and I could perfectly see it. To the dark grey sand, the bright sea, and the big boulder in the middle, it was not far from the shore. But something strange was on it, so I got a bit closer. At first, I was startled because who in their right mind could sleep on a boulder, half immersed in the cold water of winter at 3 a.m? But that was where things got weird. The thing looked like a woman at first, but instead of legs, it seemed to have a strong tail, covered in scales with what looked like a shark fin on top of her back. Her skin seemed grey, but with the night the way that it was hard to tell, because everything else around me was pretty grey as well. She seemed asleep though, with her head resting on her forearms. In panic, I shouted to my friend, Myra, to put the headlight of the car on, because I wanted to see it better, and when I looked in front of me again, there was this thing. I will never forget it as long as I live too. She was staring at me, her bottom half lying on the boulder while she was standing on her webbed hands, which seemed to end with sort of claws. Her hair was moving with the wind, but it was weird, almost like snakes, but it wasn't really snakes. It's hard to describe that bit. She had 2 large white eyes with no pupils at all or eyebrows, and instead of a nose, she sort of had 6 slits on both sides of her face, and her mouth was extremely small, thin, with no lips. I was frightened by her eyes staring at me. I couldn't move a single muscle in my body. I just stood there frozen. Then I hear my friends run to me, and before they arrived, she turned on her tail and disappeared into the sea with a loud splash and waves all around. And just like that, she was gone. All of this happened in seconds, mind you, but man, it felt so much longer than that. My friends, they didn't see anything, and I was too shocked to tell them. Plus, I knew that they probably wouldn't believe me anyway. To this day, they still don't know what happened to me, and I never really told anybody either. I mean, again, nobody would have believed me anyway, and to be honest, I really wouldn't blame them. If this would have happened to anybody else, I never would have believed them either. And frankly, I didn't want to be called crazy. Sometimes I wonder if I wasn't crazy, but then one day, several months after that night, I saw on TV that a diver was apparently scared to death at the same area. Doctors said that he must have seen something really scary. I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but it definitely freaked me out. I still don't know if she was good or not. I was just too scared. All I know is that I was just terrified. Humans are scared of the unknown, I guess, and this definitely proved to be true. Since then, I've been scared to swim. I live on an island, so of course there is the sea all around, but I just really don't go there. I'm still too scared, and I don't ever want to see anything like that ever again. I never return to that beach because, well, I know what's out there. So my dad and I flip houses for a living. We do everything, so house renovations can take anywhere from a couple of months to a year and up. But this is what happened to us in a 100-plus-year-old farmhouse in northwest New Jersey, USA, about 3 years ago. This old farmhouse was beautiful, but extremely run down. It had sat vacant prior to our purchasing it for at least 15 years. Also, there was evidence that squatters had been there at one point. The house had good bones, as they say, so it wasn't worth it to tear it down and start from scratch. The first part of our job is the cleanup and demo. I've noticed that every house has its own vibe and energy. However, this old farmhouse was a bit different. It was 4 floors, including basement and attic. Anytime you were downstairs on the main floor, kitchen, living room, and office, it felt fine, normal even. But when you went upstairs, it was different. There was just a heaviness up there. I would announce every time that I came in the house, "Hey, it's just me. Is it cool if I come up to do such and such?" I also would announce myself any time that I would come into the house downstairs with a, "Hey, how you doing today?" My dad would look at me like I was crazy because I never did this anywhere else, ever. And to be honest, I don't know why I did it here. I just sort of felt the need to, I guess. Like a deep itch in my brain, pleading me to say it. So I just did, each and every time. Now, within the first few days of the clean-out and demo, my dad found something disturbing. In the master bedroom upstairs, there was a small closet with a light in it. Hanging on the inside of the closet door on a coat hook was a bloody dog collar. There were weird symbols spray-painted only in the closet as well. Something looked like it had been burned in a pile on the floor in the closet. I refused to touch it and got extremely upset at the sight of the dog collar. Furious even. I mean, who would do something to a poor animal like this? I was so bothered that my dad told me to go home for the day, and I did. It just makes me sick thinking about the sick people who would do whatever to have something like that there, and my dad and other co-workers cleaned it out. Also, the light in that closet, we never got to work. We do minor electrical repairs all the time, and we just could not figure it out. Had a master electrician come, and they couldn't get it to work either. New light fixture, new wiring, new everything, and nothing just ever seemed to work. In any case, when we had finished cleaning out the living quarters, we decided to work on the attic and the basement. The basement was okay. Honestly, the bottom half of the house, basement and second floor, kitchen, office, and living room felt fine, neutral even. But the attic was terrible. I could not bring myself to go up there, not even once. Not to be that guy as well, but I worked on the other floors of the house, and my dad understood without me even having to explain, which honestly speaks volumes because he is real skeptical. Now one day, I had to hold the flashlight for my dad while he was in the attic. I stood on the stairs with only my head and upper torso sticking into the attic space. The lights never would work up there either, but this attic had one of those pull-down from the ceiling foldable ladders. It was located in the hallway between the master bedroom, second bedroom, and only bathroom. And the second that we opened it, this rank smell hit us hard in the face. Death. For sure, something must have died up there, we thought. There were those large black flies that seemed to swarm to rot and death everywhere as well. To say that it was an infestation of flies is honestly an understatement. I stood on the ladder, almost falling multiple times from furiously swatting these demon bugs away. My dad looked everywhere for the cause of the flies, for days even, and he just never found anything. Before we sold the house, we finally got the flies to go away. This was after months of trying, by the way. However, when the new owner chose to rent the house out, the flies apparently kept coming back. And to this day, almost 3 years later, exterminators, pest control guys have been called out multiple times, and the flies always still seem to come back. The master bedroom too had something else happen after the closet was cleaned up. I talked my dad into burying the dog collar, by the way, but there were 4 windows in the master, 2 windows on the north wall and 2 on the west. The north wall windows, one suddenly just had 2 bats on them, and they were somehow wedged between the glass and the screen of this old window. We needed to replace all the windows anyway, so we tried everything to free the bats without hurting them. We worked during the day, so bats being nocturnal, we figured that it explained why they never moved during the day. But when we would come the next day, they seemed to have moved overnight, so we knew that they were alive. But these poor bats had me seriously fretting. Any dead bugs I found during the cleanup, I would put into this windowsill, hoping that they would eat them. I know that that's weird, but I don't know, I'm a die-hard animal lover, I guess. But it appeared that they were stuck, and it was killing me to see them like that. But it also made no logical sense how they got in there either. Also, it was early summer, so they weren't hibernating either. In the end, my dad and I decided to get a ladder and try from the outside of the house. He finally got it so that the bats could undoubtedly get out if they wanted. But the bats, they never moved from that window screen for weeks. And then, one day, they were just gone. I thought for a long time that my dad had discovered that they were dead and disposed of them as to not upset me. But he promises me that he didn't do that, and that after weeks of them moving barely inches, they had indeed left of their own volition. We eventually finished the house and sold it. The new owner rented it out to tenants. Tenants would move in, stay for a month or 2, then break their leases and move out. This apparently happened 4 times since we finished, and after each move out, we were contracted to come and do a fresh coat of paint, deep clean, patch up a hole, or any other fixes needed. And the feeling of that house, it just never changed. Also, I want to add too that we told the new owner about all the weirdness prior to them purchasing. My dad is a skeptical guy, and he really has no explanation for any of this stuff either. My dad also announces himself anytime that he goes into the house now. We met every tenant that lived there at some point in their rental life, and they all seem like normal people and not the type to just break their leases for no reason. I don't know. I feel like the house needs a cleansing or something. But to whoever did that poor thing to that dog and made the house dirty like that, whoever you are, I hope that you reap what you sow. This happened a few years ago, around mid-November. My mother and I loved being outside and going for walks. This night in particular was freezing, but we decided that we wanted to go out for a quick walk anyway. As we walked back home, we went down this one street that we used all the time. It's a neighborhood street that leads to the main street, then back to our neighborhood. We get about halfway down the street when I hear a dog bark over the music on my phone. I turn it off and turn to look for the dog because, well, I love dogs and I wasn't aware that there was a big one on the street. Context too, I know quite a few people on this street, and I know which houses have dogs. Most of the people on the block have small dogs or cats. This came from a house that didn't seem to have a dog, let alone a big dog. In any case, I spun around and what I saw was a big dark mass just feet from me. If he stepped 2 more feet, he would have been able to grab me. I immediately felt weird and started speed walking back to my mum, who at that point didn't realize that I'd stopped. I turned off my phone and whispered to her that I thought that we were being followed. She turned around, grabbed my arm, and told me that there were two men right behind us. We started walking in a zigzag pattern, and sure enough, they followed our every step. Once they caught on that we knew, one of the dudes started to make small chit-chat with us. "Awfully late for you to be walking, huh?" I swear his voice sounded like the definition of siren sounds, luring sailors to their doom. He continued asking questions to us though. My mum kept walking and replying with quick replies. From the sound of his voice, I knew that we were in danger, so I went to dial 911. But instead, my mum told me to call my dad as he would be able to get to us much quicker because we were almost home now. We got to the busy street and looked behind us to see them speed walking to us. We decided to risk it and ran to the middle of the street as cars passed on either side of us. We ran across again and met my dad on that side. We looked back across the street and now both men were gone. We got into the car and searched the streets, but these guys disappeared into, honestly, what seemed like thin air. I asked my mum if we would have been kidnapped if I hadn't have heard that dog, and she asked what dog. I asked her how she didn't hear this massive dog bark, especially with how good her hearing is, and I still have no clue what it was that I heard, but I know that whatever it was, it most likely saved my life. I wanted to share a story that honestly is quite chilling, with the permission from my grandpa, of course. I'll admit that I'm still a bit skeptical about this story, but the more that I thought about it, the more horrifying it is. So, for a bit of background, I'm half Filipino and half American. Every summer my parents and I would visit the Philippines and usually stay at my grandparents' place. A week ago, my grandpa, on my mum's side, told me this true story from his youth. And the way that he said it, I noticed that he was still shaken and scared from, well, whatever happened. Back in 1970, when my grandpa was 18, he was dating this girl who was a year younger than him for over a year. Her name was S. S was beautiful, sweet, kind, and easy on the eyes, according to him anyway. When summer started, S invited him to her parents' home in the province. S was currently staying with her aunt while she went to school in my grandpa's town. My grandpa was skeptical at first because the area that S lived in was quite rural and would take 5 hours to arrive by bus. But grandpa was infatuated with S, so he said, why not? So, with the permission from his parents, he packed up and he and S were on their way. When they arrived at her hometown, he noticed that a lot of people were staring at them. It was a small town, so the population wasn't that big. S showed him around, where the shops were, the diners, etc. But Grandpa would notice people staring at them a lot. At one time he heard a couple whisper, "aswang." Now, in Filipino folklore, an aswang is a malevolent shape-shifting, flesh-eating monster. From what I learned, by the day they look and act like normal people. However, at night they reveal their true selves. Anyway, S and Grandpa arrived at S's house. It was a large 3-story wooden home. Grandpa then met S's parents. They greeted him warmly and invited him in, and exchanged talks over dinner. Grandpa said that they seemed like a couple of nice, normal people, but on the first night, he was sleeping in S's room on the second floor, and Grandpa woke up hearing what he described as a strange noise. The first thing that he noticed was that S was gone. He assumed that she must have went to the bathroom or something like that, so he lied down again. But the weird sound continued. It was coming from the floor above him, and he said that it sounded like a cat scratching its claws on the wooden floor, accompanied by what sounded like a person mumbling. He tried to ignore it, but it started getting louder until he could hear multiple clawing noises from above, like multiple cats scratching on wooden floors as well as mumbling. S still hasn't come back at this point, which made him worry. But that was when he heard loud thumping from upstairs, like a person jumping. Grandpa is really weirded out at this point, obviously, so he covers his ears with his pillow. The next day, he told S that their cats were really loud and that he couldn't sleep. S just looked at him confused and said, "We don't have cats." "Huh, that's weird," he says. "I could have sworn that I heard cats last night." On the second night, he was woken up again by the same sounds. He says at that point he was thinking, "What is this?" And then he hears louder grunting from above like an animal in pain. He tries going back to sleep, but then he's startled by what sounded like a roar. This continues for another day, until on the fourth night, Grandpa decided that he had had enough. He was going to man up, march upstairs, and see what the heck was going on. So, it was around 1 in the morning according to him. He said that it was strange because he didn't hear any more of the weird sounds, but he decided to go upstairs anyway. He tiptoed across the floor and reached the stairs leading to the 3rd floor. Once he reached the 3rd floor, he notices something weird. The lights wouldn't work, even though they were working fine before he went to bed. The only source of light was the moonlight which illuminated the interior. He makes his way to the room that was above him on the 2nd floor, where the sounds were coming from. And what he saw made the hairs on the back of his neck instantly stand up. The floor was littered with claw marks, the windows were wide open, and there were bloodstains all across the floor. There were also no signs of S or her parents anywhere. Freaked out, he went back down to the 2nd floor, but then his nose caught a whiff of something that he hadn't noticed before. It was coming from what seemed to be the kitchen. Curious now, he went to take a look, but it was so dark that he could barely make anything out anyway. As he walked, his hand touched something that felt like a large metal pot. He opened the lid, and a great number of flies escaped, and his nose was assaulted by an extremely awful and putrid smell that he said nearly made him vomit. It was so dark that he couldn't see what was inside the pot, so he immediately slammed down the lid and ran back to the room and forced himself to sleep. The next day, during lunch, S's mother served him animal blood that's been cooked and mixed with herbs and spices. But my grandpa excused himself and lied that he was feeling sick. He didn't want to know what was in the food. S's mother tried to coax him into eating it, saying that he'll regain his energy from this. And this is when Grandpa takes the opportunity to try to find out the truth. You see, in the folklore, to identify whether or not a person is an aswang is quite simple. Observe their eyes, and if your reflection is upside down, then they're an aswang. Grandpa stared at S's mum's eyes, and he reeled back in horror, because he saw his reflection was upside down. This is when the mum's expression completely changed. She went from concerned to what seemed to be angry, and was glaring hard at Grandpa, an expression that basically said, according to him, "You shouldn't have done that." That night, Grandpa doesn't waste any time, immediately packs up, and he heads home. He lied that there had been a family emergency in order to get out of there, but he finally returns home and spent a lot of time inside of his house in complete fear. The following month, he breaks up with S, and she looked at him in sadness and said that apparently she understands, that it was a wise choice for him, but it was quite a shame. Grandpa ended the story, and he said that it really was a huge shame because he really wanted to marry S. But what do you guys all think? What are your thoughts and opinions about this story? Like I said, I'm still a bit skeptical about the whole thing, obviously, but yeah, if you would like to share your opinions, then I would appreciate that. This story happened to my mother and younger sister, who I'll refer to as S in this post. It happened in Brooklyn, New York in the late 90s. I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, and S was around 4 years old. So, we had a back porch, overlooking a small fenced yard and lawn. We get the occasional regular-sized praying mantis. according to S. One day, though, she was playing in the yard while my mum was hanging laundry up on the back porch. Apparently, this thing just suddenly materialized right in the middle of the yard. This is because S says that she turned around and there it was. She said that she just stared at it for a few moments, not sure if it was a toy or not. She said that it looked like a 2.5 to 3 foot long praying mantis with big red eyes and tiny black pinpricks for pupils. When the fear finally hit her, S ran up the stairs shouting for Mum. All she could express at the time was that it was a big bug. My mum barely reacted, of course, because kids get scared by normal bugs all the time. But this thing actually followed S up the stairs. For so long I've imagined what that must have looked like, but S convinced my mum to go inside with her. That's when my mum finally saw it. While she and S were watching it from inside through the mesh door, the praying mantis perched itself on one of the chairs on the porch. Not like on the top of the back cushion or on the armrest or something, but just in the chair proper, like sitting there. When my mum went looking for a camera, all at once it just disappeared. I asked if it flew away, but neither of them had any answer. They just said that it was gone as instantly as it showed up. When my dad brought me home from school, maybe around half an hour to an hour later, it was still hiding behind the mesh door looking terrified. I never got told the full version of this story till S was a bit older. For years she would become hysterical if she ever saw a praying mantis or even the image of one. I wondered about what this thing could have been or why it only showed itself to Mum and S. I do know, however, that as I got older I found out that my mother was a very abusive woman, and S and I believed suffer the most because of it. It makes me wonder if one of the people that I've told this story to is right about it being a demon or maybe something else, or perhaps at least a bad omen. Whatever it was, it's a weird story, I acknowledge that, and it's something that has just always stuck within our family. When I was about 10 years old, my mum had her second kid. We didn't have a ton of money, so it wasn't uncommon for our cars to break down or need to be repaired. And well, one day my mum, my baby sister and I were heading to my aunt's house. She lived kind of up in the mountains, so to get there we had to take a pretty steep inclined highway, and it sort of veered off into the more rural area where my aunt lived. Maybe about halfway up the incline, my mum's car started to sputter. We could feel the car giving out, and I remember my mum just trying to get the car as close to the exit as possible. And well, the car unfortunately didn't make it, and we broke down on the side of the highway. This was before cell phones were popular, so the only way to get help was to walk to the nearest payphone. We were probably about maybe half a mile or so from the exit, and right off that exit was a gas station. My mum told me to get as close to the guardrail as possible, and we began walking. Within a few moments, a man pulled up beside us and asked if we needed a ride. My mum cradled my sister, shoved me to the side, and quickly said no to the man. She did that hip bump thing that people do, and at first I was like, what the heck? Because if I would have fallen over the rail, I would have tumbled down a pretty steep hill. But then I looked over and very clearly saw a gun on the man's front seat. It was half covered with a handkerchief, but it was clearly a small handgun. He pulled it closer to him and tried to fully conceal it, but both I and my mum had already seen it. He drove slowly beside us, trying to convince my mum to get into the car with him. But my mum just kept saying no. She wasn't rude or mean about it, calm as a clam, just friendly as she could be. He finally pulled off as we got closer to the exit, though. I'm guessing that he wanted to stay on the highway. Once he pulled off, my mum looked at me and said he was going to kill us. And the way that she said it was eerily calm. When I was in high school a few years ago, I was asleep in bed on a weekend. I woke up at like 2 in the morning because I heard yelling outside. My dad works the graveyard shift for context, but he usually gets home at like 5 or 6 in the morning. I thought that it was really weird, but I hurried downstairs in any case, because it sounded just like him. He was yelling my name, telling me to let him in and to help him. I woke up my mum as well. She was obviously less than thrilled to be up, although she heard it too because she then said, "What the? Why is he yelling like that?" As we both headed to the side door to let him in, he just wasn't there. His car wasn't there either. In fact, nobody was. And as soon as I opened the door, the yelling stopped too. My mum and I just stared at each other for a good few minutes, unsure what we'd heard, because it was so weird. I even asked her again if she really heard it too, and she confirmed it. The thing that made me bring this up, though, was something that happened yesterday. You see, I'm in college now, on summer vacation. This time I was drawing in my bedroom, and I should mention too that right now my mother is visiting family on the other side of the country, so I'm home alone at this time. It was around 10:40 when I heard the exact same thing, except it was now my mum's voice, except she was just yelling my name outside. It lasted like a minute, but I didn't answer the door like last time. And all I can say is that it was really strange, and I figured that I should share it here because it was so recent, and see if anyone knows what I should do about, well, whatever this is. When I was a little girl, my family lived in a small house. I was about 4 years old, living with my sister, mum, and dad, and it wasn't uncommon for other brothers and sisters or cousins, etc., to be around and witness things too. Now, my memory from the time in this house is a bit vague as I was so little, but the paranormal events are still easy to remember. I was a normal girl too until we moved into this house. Well, I guess I was normal. But once we did, my behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbed. Behaviors included things like running full force into closed windows and putting my head through the glass, trying to run onto a road in front of a car, drawing my house on fire, drawing myself stabbing my dad. But this isn't where it ends. You see, the hauntings in the house took place in my bedroom that I shared with my older sister by 10 years, and mainly seemed to take place in that room. For the most part, nothing too strange occurred daily besides an eerie feeling, I guess. But when events did occur, they were definitely major. Like once, while walking down a hallway, my toy castle flew out of the room hard enough to crack the hallway wall. We were all going to bed after a party, and we had guests staying that night, and as we walked down the hallway, the castle just flew hard enough into the wall to do that. We all were very unnerved and freaked out, obviously, going to bed shortly after that. Then a strange event when my sister would open the window, and as soon as she was near it, it would slam shut. She got hurt a few times because of this too. My behavior in the house was getting worse as well as this was all going on, and I apparently became obsessed with playing in my bedroom closet. I'd go into the closet with my toys, but my memories of what took place after that are completely blank. The closet was small, but contained a small step-up ledge. There was a bar to hang hangers on, and that was about it. Apparently, I would play in the closet every day until one day my dad made the decision to seal the closet shut. You see, one night, my sister was sleeping. She woke up screaming, saying that she saw a little girl in a dress hanging in the closet. It was then that my mum and dad ran into the room comforting us. The next day, my dad began sealing the closet shut so that I couldn't get in and the door couldn't open. Years later, I found out that the reason that he did this is that the same night my sister saw the girl, my dad had a dream about the exact same girl hanging in the closet. It didn't take long after these events that we moved, but other notable events that took place are shadows under the doors, crying from a closet under the basement stairs, a strange song that would always play all over the house, me getting pushed down the basement stairs, seeing something and then blacking out. And it was after this that we moved. But years later, while looking at childhood memories, my mum showed me kindergarten homework. And this is where I discovered my toddler drawings of my house being on fire and me harming my dad. But it gets worse. You see, one of the papers asked me my favorite hobby, and me as a 4-year-old wrote, "Play with the girl in my closet." That toddlery formative time in my life feels like it was a dream. I have almost no memories besides the paranormal events really, and even some of those I think I'm missing. However, even after leaving that house, disturbing things would happen with me. Even in other homes, I'd get this nagging thought in my mind. Go into the closet, close the door, put a hanger around your neck. Lights would flicker, there'd be strange sounds, but the worst is definitely waking up and seeing a girl next to me. For the longest time too, I choked waking up, and I would see this girl within night terrors. But I could move and scream and run even. But otherwise, it was very traditional in terms of being like sleep paralysis. I wake up every once in a while to the same girl sitting near me. She has hair covering her face, and it's always very dark. Once I woke up and she was sitting in my chair. Once she was hanging from the ceiling, then standing in a TV reflection. I always saw a shadowy figure standing just outside of my vision as well, which was always a bit strange to me. Ever since we left that house, though, I've had this disturbing feeling and connection to the events there. My memory is nothing but amnesia. After that house, I experienced awful deja vu as well. I really don't know how to explain it, but it's almost as if the girl and I somehow became connected, or she inhabits me somehow. I started researching last year to try and find any phenomena that could explain this. 2 souls in one body, a ghost kicking with the living person's soul out and taking over, anything. And I think the far more likely explanation is that she followed me and has all of this time. I can't help but wonder if the happy little girl that I remembered from my childhood, me, didn't meet an awful fate at some point. Sometimes I just don't recognize myself anymore, and I was never the same after that house. I'm mentally sound beyond depression, by the way, so I would love an explanation for what the heck has been haunting me my whole life. So I would like to start by saying that I grew up in Mexico, in a small tiny town where everybody knows everyone. And my family wasn't very wealthy by any means, but we were one of the more well-known families, as my family was huge. I mention this too to show that my hometown was pretty safe, especially for me at the time. Now, I grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and even though I didn't get a lot of the things that kids in the US got, I did live in the go home with the street lights on sort of era. And unfortunately, my parents weren't around for most of my childhood, a lot of the time anyway. They weren't divorced or anything, but they just weren't very great together. But I got used to going home at all hours of the night, is what I'm getting at. Sometimes I wouldn't even go home instead of spending the night at a friend's or cousin's house. But one night, during summer break, I decided to stay late at a cousin's house watching movies and just generally playing around. Time went by and it became pretty late. I didn't want to stay that night because of some private drama that had been going on between my aunt and uncle, so I decided to go home instead. It was well past midnight at this point when I left. The night was cloudy but bright with a full moon. Not many stars could be seen and the clouds covered the moonlight a lot. The walk home wasn't very far, just around the block, which was almost 3/4 of a mile or so. It also didn't bother me much because all the houses lining both sides of the street were family members, almost anyway, all the way home. But my block was always the darkest in the neighborhood though. It had 4 light posts, but only 2 ever actually worked. One by my house and the other at the corner house next to mine. Of course, my cousin's house was in the direction of the dark side of the street. A few neighbors did have front door lights, but they honestly didn't help much. The corner house was always going in and out anyway, but that meant that sometimes people lived there and sometimes it was abandoned. Many people thought that it was the cartels coming and going, which it probably was, but that's a story for another time. The next house to that, though, was owned by an old lady, a retired nurse that lived there my entire life, and who knows how much longer after I moved. But the house next to hers is the reason that I'm telling this story. You see, it had been abandoned my whole life. Overgrown grass, broken windows, doors falling off hinges, and everything that you would picture an old creepy house to be like. There was even a very big overgrown bushy mesquite tree. I'm not sure how tall, but I would say at least 30 feet. And that tree always made it even more dark for a good stretch of the street. It blocked off even more moonlight, and as I approached that house, every night I walked by, I would usually go around the block taking the long way home or squeeze myself against the opposite side of the street. This night, though, I decided to just push through as I was getting increasingly tired pretty quickly. I hyped myself up like every kid did when doing things that scared them a bit. I started walking fast, but when I got to the house, I then heard somebody calling me. Not by name, but just someone saying, "Hey kid, and come over here. Want to play games?" Now, my hometown did have homeless people and all that, but they mostly kept to the project homes that the state governor started funding, but my hometown was never really finished. My mind automatically went to, that's not human for some reason, and my body just froze. I couldn't move, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I have no idea how long I stayed standing like that, but man, it felt like a long time. I tried to turn and look at what was calling me. The whole time it hadn't stopped, mind you. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to come closer or be making any attempt to come closer, in fact. I finally fully looked at it, and I felt my heart jump to my throat. What I saw was a kid standing next to the abandoned house. He was fully visible and illuminated, which at first didn't register in my mind, but how could I see him perfectly fine, even though while standing under the shadow of the tree like that? My heart now felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. It was beating so fast that I thought it was about to explode. I managed to make eye contact at one point with this kid, and all of a sudden it began calling me by my actual name. By now, it had started actually walking towards me. It seemed to take one step every few words, and it then went completely black for a few seconds and emerged again into the light, but this time it looked exactly like me, even wearing what I had on at the time. Now, I don't know what took hold of me, but I managed to break out of whatever spell or whatever I was in and began running for my life. As soon as I ran, though, I stopped hearing it call my name. It felt like a lot of weight was lifted off of my chest and shoulders too, which was weird. But being just a few houses away from mine, it wasn't a long run, thankfully, although it felt a lot longer than normal, that's for sure. Now, to this day, I don't know what that was, and I never did see anything like that again. I told a few friends about it years later, and they thought that it was all some kind of demon. I have absolutely no idea what it was, if I'm being honest, or what it wanted. I have long since moved away from my hometown in Mexico entirely, but I still have many stories from back then. But for now, this one will have to do. Thanks for listening. I rescued a pit bull from a neglectful family. She was skin and bones when she came home and extremely submissive. After a week of love, affection, and food, she was the most amazing dog that I'd ever met, though. The softest, cuddliest baby who wouldn't even play fight with me unless she was under a blanket and did not know that it was me. I needed to do a quick late-night run to my local shop one night. There's a 40-minute round-trip route on main roads with houses, or a 15-minute round-trip route through an alleyway that wraps around the back of a school field. This alleyway has no street lamps, but I had never heard of anything bad happening, so I really didn't think too much of it. I set out with my dog in tow, and just before we reached the entrance, she stood still as a rock. I gently tried to usher her to follow me, but for some reason she refused. When I took my headphones off, I realized too that she was softly growling now and that I could hear a group of male voices coming from the alleyway. They soon came close enough to where I could see them, and I think there must have been around 5 or 6 of them. This was during COVID, mind you, so they were all wearing masks with their hoods up. My mum always told me that if I found myself in a situation like this, to not act scared. Being scared shows that you're an easy target. So, with that in mind, I tugged firmly on my dog's lead to get her to follow me. She stuck to my side, literally pressing her body against my leg as I walked. Yeah, it was awkward. I tried very hard to walk normally, but it was difficult. But she was quietly growling the whole time. The men had stopped and were standing slightly off the path to one side at this point. They were also talking quietly amongst themselves as we walked by. I couldn't really hear much as my heartbeat was pounding in my ears and my gut was screaming at me at this point. But once I knew that I was at a point where the darkness of the alley made me essentially invisible, I heard one of them raise their voice slightly and say, "Nah, that's a pit," in a way that sounded like he was disagreeing. Now, I admit that they could have just been discussing the breed of my dog, but the gut feeling I had while walking past and for the duration of my walk through the alley makes me believe otherwise. I do think that these men were discussing possibly robbing me or perhaps even worse, and my soft baby, who was literally scared of her own reflection, deterred them due to her being an aggressive breed. It's safe to say, too, that we walked a long way home after that, and I never went back there. During a university trip to a ski resort, me and some friends went to watch the stars one night. We were all part of the astronomy club, and we wanted to note down some key information that we wouldn't have seen with the bright city lights. It was our first year at the university, and we went to the forest, which was still pretty close to the skiing place. We took some pictures and noted some things down, until our legs got cold, so we decided to go back. 2 of my friends, Steve and Bob, they fell down, grabbing us thanks to instinct, which led us all to fall down as well. Note, we crossed the barrier at this point, and that's why we kept falling. We were rolling, but since our hands and arms were cold and we ourselves are pretty tired, we really couldn't move despite our best attempts. After a while, we dropped to this unused ski trail that was double black diamond. We later learned that the trail was actually abandoned, but didn't know it at the time. And as we stood up, we all distinctly remember being watched. Time also seemed to go really fast somehow, but that's probably because we were tired and the place was pretty calm. But we walked around the trail, and then we heard the scream of a man. At first we thought that somebody had tripped like we did, so we ran to help them, yelling for them. There was no response, but no response ever came from the man, other than screaming, moaning, groaning, and crying. We yelled again, but the man never responded. As we closed the distance, some of us became a bit nervous and tried to back off a bit, because we were thinking that the man might hurt us. But as we walked just a few steps closer, we saw the shadow of a 30-ish-year-old man weeping. We were probably maybe 20 meters away now, but that man was honestly one of the most terrifying things that I'd ever seen. Doing nothing but crying out there in the snow with nothing but a jacket on and a pair of sweatpants. As soon as we saw him, we just booked it as fast as we could, holding back the pain. We spent a good 30 minutes reclimbing that cliff, and when we finished, we quickly ran back to our rooms. We reported the incident to the police, but I never heard back the response about anything. But it was legitimately one of the most terrifying things that has ever happened to me, or my group of friends. I still have no idea what that guy was doing out there, so underdressed like that as well. But all I do remember is that the whole thing felt like it was maybe 5 minutes. And while my memory is not the best, I do remember that what felt like 5 minutes wandering around ended up being almost 15 minutes outside. Like, we found it hard to account for the time that had passed. It was strange, and I still really don't have an explanation for any of it. What I will never forget is hearing the screams and the moans coming from that guy out in the dark of the night, where really nobody should be. So around 11 years ago, I was a telecoms engineer. The normal day went to a few residential houses, either fitted or fixed phone lines. Everything was no different from any other day. But then I downloaded my next job and I got a 20-line installation. Now, this is not the norm for the role that I had, as these tasks usually went to other teams, really. No issues though. I thought that it would be nice to be somewhere for longer than an hour or two, I guess. Better than being here and there and everywhere, I suppose. And I called the contact. It's a contact center who tells me that either the caretaker or manager of the building is aware and will explain what was required when I get there. So I arrive, and it's a really old building, built in the 1920s, I later found out. I make my way in, tester and tool bag, as is the norm. And after speaking with the receptionist, I discover that the building was at one point a nursing home, and after being derelict for a few years, it's now being used as offices for various businesses. As promised, 2 managers arrived to tell me that they think what I am looking for is in the cellar, as there's a lot of cables down there, and that's all that they really know. So I asked if the caretaker is about, as they usually know these types of things. I was told that he wasn't, as he was ill, but due back in the next day or two. I follow this man and woman to a number-padlocked door, and they open it, tell me the code, and on the other side of the door is a stairwell that just leads down to the cellar. So as we get down there, the light is pretty poor. In fact, it's really poor, I guess, but I have no chance of working like this, and I mean, there were lights, yes, but you're talking to pendant lights that weren't really great, and understanding this, the woman tells me that they have hanging lights, so no issues. I go back to the van, grab an extension, and head back towards the cellar. So as I'm passing the receptionist, she asked us, "Are you going to be in the cellar on your own?" So I just replied, "Yeah, sometimes you have to, but if what I'm looking for isn't there, I won't be for long, I guess." She laughed, but told me, "Better you than me. Nobody likes going down there, even for storage space." Now, I'll be honest, I just thought people don't like stairs to a dark place. No worries, but not something I'm unfamiliar with, so it just needs to be done. And after a quick look around with the make manager, we find a socket. I sort the lights, and yep, there is the DP that I'm looking for, but it's an older sort of solder block, no good for broadband, so I let him know that this is going to take a bit longer, and this is even before knowing where these 20 lines need to go. He just agrees and shows me where the office fitters have left all the cables for the clients, which to my relief was in the cupboard behind the receptionist. So all set, knowing what I know, I now crack on. I'm testing all the lines, and it's going pretty well. I've more than half gone through all the cabinets and a few shy, but I know the area and know from there I can get them through, as it's got 200 pair cables that run through it. At this point, it's around 4 o'clock, and I don't have the blocks that I need on the van, so tag up the cables and turn off all the lights on my way out before closing, and lock the door on the way out too. I sign out and tell the girl at the desk I'll see her tomorrow, and I leave. On my way home, I call my manager to tell them the script and that I may actually need a hand for half a day or more, as I'm not even sure anything has been done in the exchange yet. The next day, 8 a.m., I get a call from one of the other lads who tells me that he's with me all day, and that's all that he knows. We sort out a roll each, and I'll push the pairs from the box to the cab, and you do the cab and exchange if needed, and then it's just a case of fitting the box and running a large internal cable from the box to behind the receptionist. I make my way into the building once again, open the door with the code, and to my surprise, all the lights are on. Now, I am 100% sure that I turned them off, so I'm guessing one of the managers may have come to check if I was still there and left them on by mistake. I go down and do what I need to do and leave to push through the cables outside, call my mate, and he's getting them by one, and so it's all going well. I finish up and I head back to fit the block. As I grab the blocks, drill and all the bits and etc., set up mark for the pilot holes and just hear, "What are you doing?" After nearly jumping out of my skin, I turn and see this man with grey overalls on. So I say, "I'm just doing what's been asked of me. Are you the caretaker?" He replies that he is, and he says that nobody has been down here for years, and he was surprised that I was there. So I just cracked on, done the drilling, etc. And then as soon as I'd stopped with the drill and it was quieter, this guy just sort of started chatting away, like, "What football team do you support? Do you mind if I watch what you're doing?" I told him no worries and just tried to be polite as I could. He then told me that his name was Gordon and that he'd been working there for over 30 years. A bit confused, recalling that the receptionist had said that I told him that I was under the impression that this place had been empty for a few years, and looking at the cabling, it's been updated for at least 15 to 20 years. He just said that things are always happening here. After about an hour of back and forth while I'm working, I hear a hello from the top of the stairwell. Expecting Gordon to answer, I didn't. Then it came again, so I turned around and Gordon has gone now. I'm thinking that I've been waffling for 10 minutes and he's not even here. I pop up and it's one of the managers asking if I'm expecting somebody, another engineer. So I apologize and explain the phone signal isn't very good down there, so he probably hasn't been able to get a hold of me. All cleared, he comes down, we chat for 5, and he tells me that we'll start at the receptionist stand and work to me while I finish. After a quick toilet break, I go back down and I'm in the final stages now. I'm just putting phone numbers to pairs as for when my mate gets there, we can connect the test and go. As I'm doing this, I hear, "Sorry about that." Again, out of nowhere, it's Gordon. So I just acknowledge it, call him clever, and make a joke that if they can't find you, they can't ask you to do anything. I continue for 5 minutes, and I've done all that I can, so I tell him that I'm just heading up to assist my mate, and we'll be done soon and out of the way. Gordon then told me that he liked the company, and it's been nice to talk. I felt saddened at this point, thinking that he was maybe treated poorly by people that I'm in the building with. So I just said, "Of course, mate. Costs nothing to be nice and have a chat." So I go up the stairs, leaving Gordon down there and help get the cable through a void and into the cellar. 10-20 minutes of trying to fish it through, we got it and we go down, and Gordon is not around and we finish. My mate tells me it's time for food and he'll go to the chippy and meet me back at the yard, as I tell him that I just need a few signatures and to make sure the lights go back on so that I can get my extension lead. I get what I need from the manager's signatures and show him where the link is behind the reception. I inform him that I need to get my extension lead, so are the lights okay there for now and all that? Or does he want me to move them as we go and there's a good light? And he states that they might as well stay for now and he'll get another lead in case anybody else needs to go down there. I head down and start unplugging the lights, and Gordon appears again, telling me that he didn't realize the lights were mine as he wouldn't have touched them. Straight away I thought, so that's why they were on this morning. But then it dawned on me that the door, it was locked. I asked him if he came down yesterday evening, and he said, "Yes, of course, I'm always here. It's where I'm needed." Confused and just wanting to disappear at this point, I said, "No worries, nice to meet you," and I place my hand and put it to shake out. He just raises his hand and says, "Hope to see you soon." So that was a bit weird, but I left, signed out, and thought nothing of it. So weeks go by, and I get a call from our control asking if I can return to this address as one of the lines isn't working and it's high level. So I say, yeah, no worries. I get there, say hello again to the receptionist. I asked if I could just check behind her first before having to go into the cellar. With some joy, it ends up being there. It just needs to be put on properly. And as I'm sorting it out, an older guy, he asks me if I was the one who was there last week. I say yes. He apologized and stated that he was the caretaker and had to take more days off than planned. I just told him, "Oh, don't worry about it, man. I'm sure Gordon will tell you where everything is." And as soon as I said this, he just looked me dead in the eyes and said, "What did you just say?" So I said, "Gordon. He told me that he's the caretaker here." This guy went absolutely white and just asked me if we could talk outside. So, of course, I followed him, and he simply asked me if I believed in ghosts. Then he told me that before this was what it was today, it was a nursing home, and the old caretaker, his name was actually Gordon. He knew this as when the building was taken over, he found an old desk to do lists and letters and requests for a Gordon, and there was a sign on the door which said caretaker, and where this desk was, that door led to the cellar. I immediately rubbished this, obviously, and started laughing, thinking him and his mate were just pulling my leg. He then asked me, though, if he was wearing overalls, which I replied he was. He just sort of looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Listen, mate, I'm not lying. Gordon passed away years ago, supposedly on the job. I just thought you should know, and it's not something that's considered funny, telling me that he has been mocked as he has also seen Gordon, but people just have never believed him. And I never really said a thing to anybody beyond that. Until one night fishing with a friend, and just like he said, he thought that I was just messing around. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. I don't normally tell this to anybody as it's just not really worth the ridicule, but after this experience, all I can say is that I guess ghosts or spirits, they're real. About 10 or so years ago, when I was a teen and still living with my parents, a very strange and creepy thing happened. In this particular house, we had all sorts of strange things going on. Too much to include now, but this particular incident was really unsettling. It was very late at night, maybe early morning hours even, very dark outside. The whole house was asleep. I have 4 siblings. My brother's room was across the hall from my parents' room, and my sisters and I slept in the basement. My parents awoke suddenly to the sound of my youngest brother's voice, 5 years old at that time, screaming out at my dad, just yelling, "Dad, Dad, Dad," over and over again in a loud and terrified voice. My dad jumps out of bed and rushes to my brother's room. It takes him all of like 3 seconds to get to my brother's room. When he opened the door, the yelling suddenly stopped. He saw both my little brothers fast asleep. He gently whispered to the brother whose voice that he had heard and tapped him to see if he was having a bad dream or something, but got no response. My dad thought that that was kind of weird, but just chalked it up to some kind of a nightmare or dream response. He walked back to his room, but no sooner did he get back into bed, literally the moment that he sat down on the mattress, they then heard my voice, this time screaming out to my mum, "Mum, Mum, Mum," over and over again. They said that I sounded completely terrified, just like how my brother sounded, and like I needed help, and that it was exactly my voice, just like it was exactly my brother's voice. But this time, the sound was coming from outside of their open bedroom window, where the backyard and the back alley is. My mum and dad looked at each other, perplexed. My mum jumped out of bed this time and decided to come and check on me in the basement, even though the voice was coming from outside. She makes her way down, and I remember this part. She woke me up in the room and asked me if I was calling out to her. I was groggy and tired and thought that she was being weird, and of course I said no, and I fell right back to sleep. As she's making her way back up the stairs, she hears my voice again, the same terrified voice screaming out to her, but from the front of the house this time. She stood by the big front window in the living room and looked out onto the street, but there was no one out there, not even a car driving by. It was totally still, and the screaming suddenly stopped. At that point, she knew that there was something sinister going on. She went back to bed, and her and my dad talked for a bit and prayed, and then they went to sleep. They didn't hear the voices again that night, but the next day she told us what happened, and obviously we were pretty terrified. She said that it was uncanny, the likeness to mine and my brother's voice. I even did an impression of what the voice could have sounded like, and my mum said yes, it was the exact same tone, sound, everything. So, I'm wondering if you guys have any theories as to why this happens, why these mimic beings take an interest in people. My gut says that it's just to mess with us and scare us, but I am curious as to what others think. On June 3rd, 2016, I had a social event. I was an Instagram influencer, and the event was a golf tournament. I posted on social to ask followers to come, so when he showed up, it didn't surprise me. Sure, the tickets were $250, but for some reason, that didn't click with me. It was a drinking event as well, and he showed up at least tipsy, but having a good time. He was also an Instagram model who I knew online. He asked me on a date for after the tournament. I was a single mum, and because of the event, my parents were watching the kid until the next day, so I said sure. We went off on the date, went to a bar and grabbed some food. The man was handsome, but mostly charming as heck. We had a beer, and then in his car he offered some weed. I rarely smoke, but decided what the heck that day. We hotboxed, then went off to a bar, and he was friendly with everyone and made me laugh quite a few times. Then off to the liquor store for more alcohol, and finally to his house. I was drunk and high, so it was easy to sleep with me. He had a bunk bed, and I remember him being on top and being very selfish and aggressive and being scared. I didn't stop him out of fear, though, and he had driven, and my car was still at the golf tournament location, and we were far too far for me to afford an Uber back to my car. The next morning, I went to the restroom, and afterward I noticed a long pipe coming from the toilet after I flushed. He came out upset because it was to water the weed him and his roommate were apparently growing, and I didn't know, or as too drunk or high still to click. I apologized deeply and was just honestly a bit scared. We came downstairs though, and I looked at the walls and the decor for the first time, and there were knives and weapons used as decorations all over the house. I waited for him to have breakfast and drive me back to my car, trying not to show my panic. In the car, I knew that I needed an excuse that wouldn't hurt his feelings, so I told him that I had a blast and I'm really bummed because I really like him, but my child's father passed away when he was 1, which was true, and I can't have CPS take him away because I'm around someone growing weed and all that. I told him that I didn't care about the weed and didn't want him to change, so it was a bummer, but I let him make out with me one last time as he dropped me off. I was shaking as I drove off because of the vibes, but the very next day, after he dropped me off, he met a girl that was 10 years our junior and an 18-year-old mini-me, pretty much. He dated her for 3 weeks, she dumped him, and apparently he stalked her like crazy, so much so that he was arrested a few times. In September of the same year, he gets out of jail the last time and he heads to a bar, meets a girl there, and takes her home, and he ends up murdering her, and it is an absolutely gruesome story what happened to her. He's currently serving life for his crime, and I get flashbacks all the time about how that could have easily been me. The summer of 2008 was a really rough time to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years getting a degree, only to find out that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping. But that summer, it became an escape to the point of almost an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health while I worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June though, and seasonably cold, wet and cloudy. The daytime highs barely touched 50 degrees, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I was going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funny enough, was to hike from Storm Lake, over Storm Lake Pass, and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to, and requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving too. The road is a narrow 2-track winding its way through the thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake, and I decided to do some fishing. The fishing, it was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise, which was nice. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine, I guess, but there are no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon too. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up in the rain clouds. But the sound wasn't getting closer or further away, and the sound was above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was sort of stationary, I guess, and constant. This was most certainly not a plane or a truck or a bulldozer. And while all of this wasn't outright scary, nevertheless my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away and I was left again with only the sound of the raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and I headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout, so... it's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing, for me anyway. They just taste like mud, I guess, and I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. Building up my fire for the night, I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast, too. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early here, and the rain clouds obscured the starlight as well. It was dark, in fact really dark that night. The sounds of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort, and starting to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself that I needed to build up the fire before bed, so I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. But being away from the fire's crackling for a moment, I could pick up that all too familiar rumbling rising in the background again. It was growing louder than before and closer as well. I thought to myself that I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. This noise was ruining my camping trip and my buzz as well. So frustrated, I yelled into the blackness of the night, "Hey, shut up!" And like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. I will admit that at that, my heart skipped a beat. I realized that that was not a convenient coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it too. I threw all the logs on the fire and I retreated back to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sort of sat there, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment, I had felt alone but safe. Now, I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt as if there were a million eyes in that dark, watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour too. I was glad that I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. Unfortunately, though, my tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but I knew that I would be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce, right? I could feel the rainwater pooling and moving under my tent. This storm wasn't letting up. The urge to get into the pickup and drive away was even more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town, but I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy 2-track road, would have been a death sentence for sure, I thought. But I still needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. So, grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and I ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time that I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night though, so I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater, thankfully, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain, and kept the campsite well lit. Now, I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. Then I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had suddenly stopped. In fact, it was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was now just embers, and the weirdest thing was that there was morning twilight to the east. I instantly looked at the truck's clock, and it now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye? I must have passed out or something. My head was killing me all of a sudden too. To be honest, I didn't feel like I had drank that much to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and I stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was now completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet, and smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my junk to the pickup and I tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. though before I finished picking up camp, and as I climbed into the cab of my truck, I then heard that rumbling again through the morning fog. As soon as I heard it, I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy bobsled track of a road, not once looking into the rearview mirror either. I have never been back to Storm Lake, and to be honest, I probably never will. So I was 10 years old, and back then, my friends and I would ride our bikes as far as we could, looking for adventure or to discover something new and exciting. At this time, my community was a mix of new and old, and it was easy to find an old tunnel, the remains of a farmhouse, or decayed paths and trails. So we set out that summer day with one extra boy than the usual crew. I had not formally met with him yet, but nevertheless we headed out on our bikes. We came across an abandoned house near a farmer's field and forest. We started to explore the premises, and we decided to settle here for a while. We walked in, checked things out, and were just sort of hanging out and sharing our findings. But at some point, I started to hear the sound of rocks or gravel, or something like that, being moved through water, sort of like slurry, emanating from the basement. I thought that it was my friends playing in the house, and so I briefly ignored it. But suddenly there was wailing, and the sound of gravel was getting louder, like thrashing, like someone was throwing rocks of gravel or something. Frozen now, there was no way that my friends could make that noise. Then, all of a sudden, quite fast talking surrounded us. My one friend started to cry uncontrollably. His brother, a pretty brave kid, was preparing to protect his brother. Together, we could see inside the house's front hall and stairwells. The new boy was giggling and gesturing us to come downstairs by waving us in with his hand. But we stood there, dumbfounded. How or what was making that noise? How did he not know the immediate danger that we were in, that he was in? I wanted to get him as I thought that this was possibly his last moment on the planet, but I watched him return up from the dark stairwell leading to the basement. He was still giggling and mirroring the exact same motion. He returned again downstairs and out of sight. We screamed at him not to go, but he kept doing the exact same thing, just over and over again. He was actually sort of speeding up too, like 2 times, then 3 times faster. The noises from the basement I can only really describe as just pure despair, like an agonizing, painful, and doom-like quality, but they were human for sure, or at least human-like. We screamed at this guy, though, that we're leaving, and it seemed like he was coming outside with us. Frantic, we just started biking as fast as possible, petrified with fear, and I didn't look back. It was dusk now, and we had no time to reconvene, so we separated immediately and went home before we were grounded. I asked my friends the next day if anyone saw the other boy, and they responded that they thought that he was somebody else's friend from our group. We ended up talking for a little while, and we discovered that we didn't even know his name or where he came from, and after that, we actually never saw him again. So, I'm going to try and sort these events out chronologically. They happened between my 14 and 20 years of age. For context, I'm currently 22. The village in question is called Mojca. It's in Poland. I've also not lived there for like 2 years now, but an important thing that I want to mention is a warm friend of mine that I met here, Jacob. He will be crucial to several situations. So firstly, the forest itself was huge, although typical of forests in Poland, I guess. My friend and I often spent our free time there. The forest had no owner, and we loved exploring it. We built a small bridge by the stream so that we didn't have to go around it or jump over it. A few days after building it, too, when we were returning home from deeper parts of the forest, as if from a tree, a stone flew towards me, which almost hit me in the head. At the time, for a long time afterwards, we joked about it, although it was a pretty dangerous situation, to be honest, because the rock was large enough probably to kill me if it hit me. Of course, we ignored it, not thinking too much of it, but it was harvest time, and as I remember, there were bales of hay in the fields at the time, which we loved to jump over. We chose fields that were more submerged in the woods so as not to risk being caught by the farmers. It was already getting dark, more slowly sunset, and on our return we saw a black figure behind a small stream, different from the first place. This forest repeatedly crossed by water. We looked at the figure for a while too, but couldn't quite make out what it was at the time. But we laughed and said that it must have been the figure that threw the stone that time. Thirdly, we saw this figure again, twice on another day, shortly after the previous incident, in the same areas. And fourthly, this is the last part where my friend was with me, and in the deeper parts of the forest we found something like rabbit holes, only bigger. We have seen rabbit dens quite often here, so I doubt that we would have been wrong, but nearby we found a traveling suitcase with strange things inside. From that moment on, too, my friend stopped attending this forest. I think something must have spooked him. I myself enjoyed running through the forest, in other parts of it, especially in the evening. I came across a phenomenon that I would mostly describe as earth-breathing, I guess you could say. In a certain area, the ground regularly rose and fell, and it was really cool to watch. But this is where things started to get weird. I covered my running route as usual, but on this day, I turned back. While running, I heard an unnatural growl from the bushes. Over the years, I've clocked wolves or foxes, but this sounded really different to that. There seemed to be nothing in the bushes too when I looked, but preferring not to tempt fate, I turned back and I went home. The growl itself was deep though and very bassy, and lastly, and probably the strangest thing, I was already of age and it was dark. It was one of the few trips after dark that I took, and I don't even remember what for, to be honest, but passing a long path in the woods, I heard not far away, but in the denser part of the forest, a kind of, I know this is going to sound weird, but choir, something like church singing. I'm not an expert, but it sounded like it was in Latin, and so I ignored it, and going back after this time, obviously, I didn't hear anything anymore. But years later, my friend and I came to the conclusion that there was probably black masses or something of that nature going on in that forest. There were also often very suspicious cars hanging around in the area for years, and I'm not a big believer myself, but to be honest, it is a possible explanation. In the end, who knows what actually all of that was, but I don't think that I'm going to go back there, just in case. So about 5 years ago, when I was 17, I visited some of my family who lived in South Dakota and worked there for the summer. After about a month, my brother, sister, and her husband decided to do what Americans do best and go shoot guns in the woods. I had to work an evening shift, so it was decided that we'd go after around 10 p.m. Once my shift ended, we went to their house to pack up the truck with some snacks, guns, and ammo. The drive took around 45 minutes, and it took us up a dirt road surrounded by trees and tall grass. Eventually, it opened up into a clearing that was pretty open and flat. The nearest tree line was about 100 feet away. It was pretty dark, but the clearing was lit up by the truck's headlights. For some reason, too, I kind of felt a bit uneasy, but I chalked that up to just being in the woods at night. For the first 20 minutes, nothing really happened, too. We were just setting up plastic bottles and those plastic gallon buckets that you get water out of at an office. But there was a feeling of being watched that we all felt, and the area suddenly just reeked of spoiled eggs. Those of you who have shotguns know what that smells like, but even since going to the military, no amount of guns, explosions have ever smelt this bad. We looked around to see if we could see the source of what it was, and what I saw, I can still vividly remember to this day. It was a thin humanoid figure crouching down, just looking at us. Even while crouching down, it was still above 6 feet in height, and when I say that this figure was thin, I mean skin and bones barely do it justice. The even weirder thing about this was, though, is that we all saw the figure in different spots in the tree line, but we all described the same features. Tall, thin, had long dark hair. Whatever the case, we quickly packed up what we could and we just left. And the feeling of dread that we felt that day will forever haunt me. Since then, my brother mentioned the area might have been in native territory, but I don't know if that's true or not. Every once in a while, I think back on that day and I look up different stories and encounters people have in those woods, but nothing ever quite resembles what I saw that day. In April 2019, I was an exchange student in South America. I went on a trip to the Amazon with a group of other exchange students, and while many strange things happened, I would like to focus on two in particular. So at the time, I was 18 years old, tall and thin and white with blue eyes, mentioned just because I always stood out as a tourist. I was fluent in Spanish, allowing me to talk to locals without misunderstandings. The first incident occurred on our first night or morning in the Colombian or Brazilian town of Leticia. We were all staying in a hotel, and it had a really strange vibe. I didn't feel comfortable, and neither did my friends. The hotel staff were staring at us like creeps, which made it even more scary. But during breakfast, I overheard other exchange students discussing a missing phone. I offered to help locate it using the Find My iPhone app, and we were able to track it down to a really sketchy part of town. The police accompanied us to the location, and we found the house where the phone was. The family denied involvement, but their behavior and the fact that the phone signal was coming from their place made it clear to us that they had probably stolen it. They came out with knives and machetes, yelling and staring at us. It was really intense, and I felt a shiver down my spine, and I had a very strong gut feeling that we needed to leave. We told the police to back off and not to do anything about the phone because we were worried about our safety, and the phone just wasn't worth it. When we came back to the hotel, the police wanted to see if there were any cameras pointed at the door of the room from the outside of it. When we came back to the hotel, the police wanted to see if there were any cameras pointed at the door of the room from the outside or the inside. The scary part is that they had cameras from the inside and outside, only these two cameras were mysteriously turned off for 2 hours that night. I also know about another incident and found out that the cameras were turned off by someone from the hotel staff. I really don't feel too comfortable sharing that, as it involved one of my friends. It was very serious and some legal actions were taken too. But one of our other stops was in a small village in Peru's part of the Amazon. I don't remember the town's name, but it had around 150 people, and the village was built on pillars above the water as the river Amazon was overflowing or something. After we arrived and settled in at the local hotel, we were taken to a stage where we were introduced to the region's indigenous dances, songs, and culture. After the performance, the group returned to the hotel, but I decided to stay back and talk to some of the locals. I wanted to see an anaconda, very dumb and touristy, I know, but someone had told me that this was a good time to see them hunt. I started talking to a local guy, and he claimed that he couldn't show me where to see a live anaconda, but offered to show me a picture of one that he had taken a few days ago on his phone. Now, despite what my parents always taught me about going to strangers' houses, I foolishly decided to follow him to this remote, isolated home deeper in the jungle. As we walked, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease and danger, though, lurking around every corner. When we arrived, he instructed me to wait in the living room while he searched for his phone, but as I stood alone in the dimly lit room, my gut told me that something was wrong. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was in grave danger all of a sudden. After what felt like an eternity, he returned and said that he couldn't find his phone. He asked me to come back the next day, but I knew that I had to get out of there as soon as I could. I thanked him and left, but my heart was pounding with fear and adrenaline. When I returned to the hotel and told my friends what had happened, they were horrified. They couldn't believe that I put myself in such a dangerous situation. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something terrible could have happened if I had stayed any longer. Looking back, I realized that the encounter was bizarre, even if he was truly just a kind person, but I just cannot shake off that feeling that something was about to happen to me. It scares me to think about how gullible I was back then. Even though I consider myself rational and sometimes even paranoid, I didn't listen to my instincts that day. And I genuinely think that I put myself in a lot of danger. So for some context, I live in a major city and currently I don't do a lot of driving due to ongoing issues with my car. Plus the pandemic has made me turn to more delivery apps in general. But the other day, around 1 PM, I decided to order some lunch after doing a lot of cleaning. I placed the Uber Eats order and found something to watch while I waited for the food. Within a few minutes, a driver accepted the order, and I noticed right away that the driver, Anthony, was on a bike and didn't have a profile picture or any deliveries on record. At first, I wasn't really alarmed, to be honest. I mean, I was sort of amused, like, oh wow, I guess I'm this person's first ever customer. But then a full 30 minutes passes with no driver movement on the app, and at this point I think that maybe something is glitching out or the driver is stuck or something, so I contact support via the chat option, and they ended up assigning a new driver because they couldn't reach the first one. Odd, but whatever, right? But now is when things started getting a little weirder. The new driver assigned is in the exact same spot as the original driver was, and they're also on a bike, also have no profile picture, and have no prior deliveries as well, and this driver's name was Laurie. I let another 20 minutes pass with no driver movements before I message them myself and say, "Hi there, are there any issues with the order?" The app shows that the driver saw the message, but no response. All this time I'm checking to see if Uber Eats is maybe experiencing issues. None that I could find though. And at this point, while I'm definitely weirded out, I'm mostly just hungry, so I contact support again to request some assistance. They reassign the driver again and apologize for the inconvenience. Same deal, they also tried to contact the driver with no response. And finally, the third driver assigned is the exact same scenario. Same spot, on a bike, no profile picture, no prior deliveries. Only this time, the name is Robert. And before I can react and go about cancelling the order at this point, because I'm tired of dealing with this, he suddenly has my food and immediately messages me the following: "Hello, have your food, what's your number?" And I respond right away with, "I'm not super comfortable giving my phone number out when you can just message me here." And he responded again with, "What's your number? Be there in 10. How old are you?" At this point, the alarm bells are going off, and I contact support immediately to have the order cancelled and get further assistance. I get connected to Uber's safety team, who informs me that the order has been cancelled, I'll be refunded, and started taking down the details of the strange interactions. As I'm giving the woman on the phone the info that she needs, I'm starting to calm down, thinking that this was just some creep or something went wrong, and that's when I hear a man's voice at the front door. "Miss, I have your food." And I can't even describe the chill that went down my spine because of the way that he said it. Making things even worse, the Uber safety woman on the phone with me heard him as well and goes, "Is that him? We cancelled the order though." I poked my head around the door. The main heavy door was open, metal screen door was closed or locked but allowed us to see each other. I get a look at him though, and when he saw me on the phone, he went from smiling to looking absolutely furious. He suddenly got right up against the door and kept asking who I was on the phone with, and at this point, I've started asking him to please leave because he's making me uncomfortable and he's getting more and more angry. And at this point, starts pounding on my door and grabbing the doorknob while shouting to be let in. The woman on the phone is asking if I'm okay. The man is still shouting, so basically I'm in full meltdown mode at this point and hurriedly close the heavy door to lock it. The man is becoming borderline belligerent as he kicks my door, and the woman tells me to call the police. He ended up walking away from my house about a minute after that and back up to the sidewalk. And for a moment, I thought that he messed up, so I finished my conversation with the Uber safety woman so she could submit the report. Once she submitted it, I called the police and told them what happened. They weren't incredibly helpful at first since he didn't actually break in or put his hands on me, and they told me that if he came back to call again and they would send an officer out. And I did end up having to call them again and give a full report, plus description of the man since he didn't end up leaving right away. He stayed in the neighborhood for almost 20 minutes in fact. According to one of my neighbors, after she heard the yelling, she saw the man that I described walk back up from my house to the sidewalk and hop into a truck with another man in the passenger seat. And they apparently just sat there staring at people walking by and being incredibly sketchy. And that's when she walked back towards my house and asked me what had happened. Luckily, she was able to give myself and the cop a description of the vehicle and the other man as well. But basically, this was a very bizarre and uncomfortable experience, and I wanted to share it, maybe to see if anyone else has had an experience like this. Because honestly, I'm still pretty shaken up by it, and will be avoiding delivery apps for quite a while after this. It was a really strange experience, and I have a feeling that there was more to it than just Uber Eats. So yesterday, I was on my way back home with truck parts that I had picked up and did what I do a lot of times. I opened up my map on my iPhone and started checking the countryside roads for any cemeteries that I wasn't aware of. I go to them and walk through and record audio and video for my own records. I located one on a narrow side road and went to the area, and when I got there I discovered that it was on private property and would be a 10-minute walk through the field to get to it. Not wanting to upset the property owner or get in trouble too for trespassing, I went to a house that was next door back a long gravel lane. As I got closer to the house, it was obvious that it was not being lived in. It was a huge 2-story farmhouse that, in its day, would have been quite beautiful, I'm sure. I decided, though, to go ahead and knock on the door. I have seen people live in worse conditions and wanted to at least make the effort to knock on the door. I'm not going to lie, though, this place was unkempt and had a pretty creepy appearance. Tattered curtains on all the windows, a few windows had been broken, etc. Nevertheless, I opened the screen door and I knocked on the door. It swung open when I knocked, exposing that the house had appeared to have been quickly moved out of some years ago. Full of furniture, clothing laying on the floor. The kitchen was visible down the hall from the front door, and you could see the table was still there. And at this, I decided to step into the threshold of the doorway and started recording with my iPhone. I yelled out hello several times, knowing that there would be no one living there, but still trying to make the effort. Due diligence and all that. Within about 45 seconds of stepping in, I was hit full-on front of my body with an air so cold that it was honestly like stepping outside in the winter night with just shorts on. It was extremely cold. Now, the outside temperature was about 60 degrees and had been very warm for several days. The house was not cold when I stepped in, mind you, but this cold air that hit me started to slowly move up my lower legs. Now, as this took place, my lower left leg, just above the ankle, began to feel as if I was being ate up by fire ants, but there were no ants anywhere. So I asked out loud, "If you're doing that to me, please stop because it hurts." And after asking several times and explaining that I was not there to do anything to the house or the property within it, the burning stopped. But that very cold air remained. I made my intentions very clear and never moved further into the house. I asked the usual questions and panned to my left and to my right, capturing each room off to my sides and the staircase that was directly in front of me. And just as I stated that I was going to leave and would maybe come back someday, I observed with the naked eye a misty apparition cross in front of me from right to left. It was also captured on my iPhone. I was by myself. I wasn't smoking. There was no fog or mist outside to somehow come into the house and move through the rooms. The house sits about 900 feet from the roadway, and the door does not face the road, so it's not like a reflection from a car or anything, and there are no other houses close by anywhere. The feeling that accompanied this, though, was nothing but dark and ominous, and definitely did not feel friendly or welcoming. I have been to many cemeteries and other places over the years, and I've never witnessed anything like this. I am a somewhat skeptical person, I like to think at least, and always try to debunk anything that I get. But this one has me absolutely speechless. I will definitely be locating the owner, and I'll attempt to get permission for an investigation at some point, because I am sure that there is something there. This happened when I was 17. I'm a female and have lived in the same house my whole life. My mum is a private caretaker and used to work overnights when I was in high school. One night, I'm home alone like normal. It's around 3 a.m. and I was up hanging out and just doing my own thing. I loved having the house to myself, to be honest, but in our living room we have 2 windows, one in the front of the house that overlooks our yard next to the front door, and the other one overlooks our driveway and the side of the house. From the second window, you can see the side of our neighbor's house across the street. So I'm in my house walking around listening to music, and I have all the lights on in the house. I'm scared of the dark. The curtains on the windows overlooking our driveway are open, but I'm not concerned at that moment. I keep walking back and forth between my room and the kitchen doing stuff. You have to walk through the living room past that window to get to the kitchen. And about the 3rd time I'm walking through, I notice a light on the side of my neighbor's house moving. I stop and stare at it. It looks like a flashlight occasionally, and I notice what looks like a hand wearing a black glove fall into the frame of the light. I'm standing there confused, just staring at the light and the hand moving near the window, when all of a sudden the light shuts off. It finally connects in my head what's happening, so I run around my house turning off the lights so I'm not visible inside the house anymore, and I duck down behind the couch under the window behind the curtain. I see what looks like a man in a black hoodie walking down my neighbor's driveway and onto the street. He turns and stops right in front of my driveway. My heart is pounding at this point. I know that he saw me in the window earlier, and I'm scared that he's going to retaliate. Then, after what seems like forever, he turns away and walks past my house. I stayed frozen in that spot for what felt like hours, I think, and I never saw him again, thankfully. Eventually, I grabbed a kitchen knife, though, and I returned to my room. I told my mum about it the next morning, but she blew me off, saying that it was probably the people who lived there, and ignored my concern. Lesson learned, I guess, is that I always make sure the curtains are shut from now on. But a weird thing was that whenever he was moving, he looked really stiff almost, like a robot, I guess. I never told my neighbors or called the cops either, which I probably should have, but I don't know why I didn't. I guess I just didn't want to blow things out of proportion. But I do wonder what he was thinking about when he was staring at me in my house while I was there, all alone, late at night. As with many, I've always been into the paranormal, but never really believed in any of it, I guess. I have sought out ways of experiencing paranormal things, but any time that I've had something, I have had a way of dismissing it and could always just chalk it up to maybe a weird occurrence. But about a year ago, I switched roles in the museum that I work at. I've been here for 5 years now, and some weird things have happened in the past, but again, you could rule most of it out as just coincidences. But when I moved into the collections department, we're the people who take care of the objects and the artifacts in the museum's possession and on loans, things got weird, really quickly. Everyone talks about the museums being haunted, and it's understandable. I mean, we house and care for lots of really old, sometimes even creepy objects, and many of them have storied pasts, and our collection is roughly 200,000 pieces. We have some doozies too. But to make it short, I've been seeing shadows, hearing my name, and having lights turn off and on and when I'm alone. Our storage is split into 3 areas. The upstairs mezzanine is home to our toy and puppet collections. Downstairs is 3 connected areas split into 2 rooms, textiles by itself and American materials and ethnographic or world objects in the main area. And the 3rd area is in a separate part of the museum, split into 2, and houses larger objects along with natural sciences. Now, the most convincing evidence I have experienced for the existence of paranormal activity happened about a month ago, and it's really stuck with me. To set the scene, I was in our textiles room, lower level storage, in a room off of the main area with the objects, in a room off of the main area with the world objects, returning some clothing that we had shown on our tour. To briefly explain the storage setup, you come down the stairs and can go left into the world objects or right and take a turn into the American materials. However, the stairs are the only thing separating the areas, so the stairwell is more like a donut hole than anything, I guess. But turning left into world objects and immediately taking another left, that will let you walk perpendicular to the aisles of world objects and brings you to the right side of the American materials. On that right wall, looking out into the American materials, is the door into textiles. It's normal practice, like with most places, to only have lights on in an area that you're walking. So I had lights on at the base of the stairwell, the very front of world objects, and that illuminated enough of my path into the textiles room to see. Up until now, I had lights turn off, doors slam, heard my name, and had objects move. Basic things, but stuff that, honestly, I could ignore. I could look past them, or obviously just explain it away. But I went down the stairs into this area and was immediately overcome with just panic and anxiety. The room was cold, and there was I don't know how to describe it, but just a bad energy, I guess. I turned around, sat in my office for a couple of minutes thinking that I was just having a panic attack and cooling off, and decided to just ignore it in the end. I went back down, hit the lights, beelined it into the textiles room, and started putting things back in place. But even here, I felt like I was being watched the entire time that I walked through the lower level. But again, I didn't think too much about it and figured that I was just being paranoid. But I just couldn't shake this gut feeling of paranoia, I guess. Then I left the room, and that's when it got bad. I opened the door, and I can see all the way across the American materials. The last shelving unit on the far wall from me is where we keep items from a famously deceased child. The family donated all of their belongings after their passing. There weren't any lights on in that area, but I could see someone. It looked like a fully grown man, probably around 6 feet tall, and the shape was hulking. But they were pitch black, like darker than any shadow of any of the room. I'm telling you guys too, with whatever oath that you want, that I could see this person that was darker than any unlit wall. And then, all of a sudden, it sprinted. I mean, absolutely ran as fast as I've ever seen anyone run, into the closest wall. Not at me, not to scare me, but sprinted to its right, which was maybe only about 10 feet away from it, into a cement wall. This all took place in about 5 seconds, and to be honest, I didn't know what to do, so in the end I just sort of stood there and then I ignored it. I just quickly walked out of the storage, flipped the lights, and I hauled it up the stairs. I got about halfway up the stairs too when the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I heard someone say my name, and the doorknob at the base of the stairs started to turn. I didn't even stop to listen, and I just got out of there as quickly as I could. Now, I'm sure that there's a way of explaining it. Again, I could have very much just been having a panic attack, but the anxiety went away just about as soon as I walked back up the stairs the first time. Since then, things have gotten stranger too, with objects moving in front of me and other people in departments or doors closing in front of us. Like I said, things have happened since I've been here, and there are plenty of stories of before I was in the department or at the museum. But this thing a month ago was just different. I'm only sharing this now too because, well, last night I had a dream where a ghost or something was holding my mouth closed and pushing on my back. And when I woke up, it seemed to be happening too. I feel like things are getting weirder and weirder with me, and I've been looking into shadow people or other sorts of weird apparitions for a little bit now, trying to figure out what all of this means. I doubt that this will get much attention, but if anyone wants to chip in on ideas as to what this might be or how to explain it, or where I should look to research, I would love to hear any and all of your thoughts. I also wish my best to all of you. So I live with my husband and 5 children in a ranch-style house, and we've been at this place for 5 years now. Our kids range in age from 13 down to 1 year. For the past 3 or 4 months, there's been something in my house, though, that seems to cry at night. It's definitely not my kids or my cats. It's something else. These disturbances typically happen between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Usually what happens is my husband and I are in our living room at night, watching TV and unwinding from the day. All of the children are asleep because they have a 9 p.m. bedtime. When suddenly, we will hear the sound of a child crying, and I mean loudly crying, not just whimpers but big sobbing cries. One of us will immediately jump up to go and check on the kids, as all of my children have had night terrors and typical childhood nightmares at some point. But the weirdest thing is that none of them are ever awake. They're all fully asleep, completely peaceful. This will always repeat too a few more times until we go to bed. It doesn't happen every single night, maybe only once or twice a week, but it's very disturbing when it does. My 13-year-old has also heard the phantom crying as she was up late with my husband and I one night on the weekend. Also, my children don't have TVs in their rooms and their tablets' switches are always off, so it's not a sound coming from something like that. They're not crying in their sleep either. They're always peaceful and undisturbed, not even moving around when me and my husband go to check on them. We don't have a baby monitor too, so there's no chance of interference coming from one. I do have 2 Siamese cats who make noises that sound like human voices sometimes, but they're always in the living room with us at night or sleeping in front of the heater in our kitchen, and I've been able to confirm that it's definitely not them. As well as the crying at night though, we often hear the sound of doors opening and closing too, most often the door to my daughter's bedroom. It makes a specific sound because the door sticks a little and you have to put some force into opening or closing it. We always go check on the children after we hear this, and all of them are always asleep. These things are not just heard by me too, but my husband as well, so I know that I'm not going crazy. And the only thing even remotely like this that has ever happened to me was when my current 5-year-old was around 2, about 3 years ago and in the same house, and we both heard the sudden and extremely loud sound of, well, what I can only describe as something or someone pretending to cry like a baby. I know that sounds weird, but it's the only way that I can describe it. Imagine a grown adult almost mockingly or pretending to cry like a newborn. That's exactly what it sounded like. It was so loud and frightening that my daughter instantly started screaming in fear, and I packed us into the car that day and we left the house and we just didn't go back for some time. We spent the rest of the day at my sister's and I refused to be alone in the house without my husband for the next couple of days too. So, what do you guys think that this could be? A demon? A ghost? I don't really believe in the idea of dead people just hanging around your house for eternity. A mimic? Well, what could this thing want? And most importantly, how do I get rid of it? In the late 90s, I went to an overnight girls' summer camp for a couple of weeks every year. It's a beautiful chunk of forest in Maine, and this campground is structured like this. There are 2 roads that go up either side of a hill. Along the roads are paths that lead to clusters of cabins, which each can house up to 4 girls. Each cabin cluster had a set of 3 porta potties, since the flush toilets were too far to walk to at night. There's a stone house foundation next to the cluster of cabins that is furthest in the woods, and from now on it will be referred to as DW. Now, I've heard a few spooky stories from DW, but never experienced any specially there myself, and my story is from when I stayed in the cluster of cabins next to the furthest one. This one I'll call BP. BP is situated where all the cabins are ways into the woods, and porta potties are between the cabins and the road that continues to DW. In fact, the potties are just at the edge of the road that continues to DW. Now, one evening, my group of campers had come home from a bus field trip. It was later than we usually went to bed, and it was very dark. The most important rule at the camp is the buddy rule, though. You never go anywhere without at least one other camper. Counselors were the only ones allowed to travel without buddies. After getting ready for bed too, my cabin went together to the porta potties. We were still energized from the trip and were very giggly, and I glanced up to make sure that we weren't straying and saw a person on the road walking toward DW, seemingly illuminated by a blue lantern flashlight. From my vantage point, the person was no longer visible once they walked behind the potties. I looked back to my friends and said something like, we're probably freaking out whoever is on the road if they can hear us, you know. And immediately, my friends asked, what person? I answered, there's a counselor going over to DW. They're behind the porta potties. They didn't see anyone, and as we approached the potties, neither did I. The road was pitch dark in both directions, and so was the surrounding woods. There wasn't even a dark silhouette, like if their lantern had died and they continued walking anyway. There was nowhere that this person could be found. They just up and vanished. I don't really remember what the person looked to be wearing. All I remember is the blue light and short, straight, almost shoulder-length light hair, looking straight ahead as they walked toward DW, and the house foundation is all I saw. The campground used to be the site of some farmland probably 100 years ago. I know this because the campground is crisscrossed by low crumbling stone walls and the farmhouse foundation in DW. I fell in it once, but that's another whole silly story. But I later learned the legends surrounding the foundation. It was a home to a small farming family, either one child or a boy and a girl, depending on who tells the story. And one day, when the father was away for market, the house burned with the other family members inside. He came home far too late, and some say that the skeletons found inside were holding each other, a mother trying to protect her children for the last time. Obviously, that is sort of folklore, I guess, but who knows, maybe it's true. And my theory is that if I did indeed see a ghost, it may have been the ghost of one of the family members, and an echo-type ghost repeating actions took in the past. I could relay the other paranormal legends I remember from the campground if anybody is interested, but again, that's a whole nother story, and yeah. Anyway, this is the only quasi-paranormal thing that's ever happened to me, so yeah, there it is. I was 12 years old at the time, in the 6th grade, and living in the south. At that time, the town's population was around 20,000, but when the local university was in session, it would nearly double. It wasn't a place where everyone inevitably knew everyone else, but if you played 20 questions with each other, you could undoubtedly find people that you both knew. My single mother and I lived in an apartment downtown and had been there for around 8 months. It was summertime, and as she worked and attended college, I was usually home alone during the day. It was the early 90s. About halfway through the summer, a girl from my school, Maria, moved into a house about a block away from us. I didn't know Maria that well, and it wasn't until she moved in that I really started spending a lot of time with her. I didn't know her parents, and they didn't know Mum. And when this event occurred, we'd been hanging out for maybe a couple of weeks. Riding bikes and going to the library together. Her mother and stepfather worked all day too, so we were mostly alone. When one day I was at her house when her mum was home, Maria and I were out in the yard when her mum came to the door and hollered at me. She was like, "Hey, did your dad ever manage to find you?" And which to me was super weird, so I was like, "What?" "Yeah," she said. "Your dad called here a couple of days ago and asked if you were at our house. He said that he couldn't find you." I was sort of stunned and had no idea what she was talking about. To Maria's mum, a virtual stranger, the call probably made sense. To those who knew me though, it was pretty wild. The actual people who knew me knew that my dad didn't live with me, had never lived with me in fact. He lived a couple of hours away in a different county, and at that point in my life, I could count the number of times that he had been to my house on one hand. There was no animosity or drama there. He could see me whenever he wanted, but we were not close, I guess you could say. He'd never been to the town in which I was living either. I hadn't seen him in probably 6 months, and seeing as how we didn't have a phone, we hadn't recently spoken either. He had no idea Maria even existed. He'd never met any of my friends. My mum hadn't even met Maria or her parents. So I was a little freaked out and asked, "Are you sure it was me that he was looking for?" She was like, "Yeah," she said. He'd apparently recited my full name, middle and all, and described me even, including my recent haircut and glasses. My dad had never seen my glasses, didn't even know that I wore them. I'd only had them for like a week. She said that he asked if she knew where I was, that he couldn't find me, and that she'd told him to try my apartment. He'd apparently said okay and then just hung up. And well, of course, I went straight to a payphone and called my dad as soon as I left. And of course, he had no idea what I was talking about. In fact, it bothered him too. To this day, I have no idea what that was about. Was it a prank call or somebody coincidentally looking for their daughter of the same name and physicality, and Maria's mum thought that it was me? Or, like, some guy actually trying to abduct or stalk me or something? But in that case, how did he know to call Maria's house? He would have needed to know Maria's parents' last name for one thing, and her mother had remarried as well. Her last name was different, in other words, and what was the point? I was often alone. I was probably easily abductible, I suppose. It's probably not a word, but you get my drift. Nothing like that ever happened again, but a few weeks later, I did get a really strange feeling after coming home from the used bookstore. I'd just gotten upstairs and had unlocked my apartment's door when something like a trepidation hit me with full force. The living room looked fine. I didn't see or hear anyone, but I got the strongest sense that someone had just been in that room seconds before. When I tried to step forward, every hair on my body suddenly stood straight up, and I didn't question it. I just slammed the door, ran down the stairs, and I stayed at that library until Mum got off work. Maria's family moved a few weeks later, but we were there for another year, and as far as I know, nothing else happened. Also, I spoke to my mum about this sometime later, and she only remembered it but said that she'd gone down and talked to Maria's parents at the time. I didn't know that. Apparently the guy had also asked if there were any places I might be, like maybe he was fishing for information. The biggest thing, though, was that he asked using my full name. My dad never used that name, and he's the only person in the world who calls me by a certain nickname, a shortened version of my longer name. My 11-year-old theorized that maybe he was planning on abducting me and calling Maria's house, posing as my dad so that when I disappeared my dad would be suspected. He may have known just enough about me to know that my parents were separated, but not enough to understand certain details, like my nickname or my parents' situation. Whatever the case, it's something that has stuck with me, and it puzzles me, but at the same time, it really freaks me out. So this happened when I was 17. I worked briefly at a truck stop. I literally worked there a week and a half, so the only person that I got to know while I was there was the janitor. We had talked on breaks, and he smoked with me once. He was a shorter guy, probably 5'5", and had a smaller frame, and he was probably in his late 40s. He has scraggly hair down to his shoulders and thinning on top. Not that it matters, I'm just painting a picture, I guess. But I'm a pretty big girl. I'm tall and built like a brick house, and if anyone was the imposing one, it was me. I never at any point thought of him as scary or anything, just thought that he was a nice older guy. So after I stopped working there, a few weeks had passed, and I was fueling up in my car, and he came up to me, and we talked, and he told me about his great weed that he had, and if I gave him a ride home after work, I might get some. I didn't think anything of it, and I drove him home. He rolled a joint and made me a drink that was about 2 fingers full, but he didn't have a chaser, so I only took a small sip. And well, he put his hand on my leg and then tried to put my hand on his junk. And at that moment, my head started swimming, and I got this gut feeling, and it was fear, pure fear. I felt faint and shot up off the couch and headed for the door. He did everything but physically stop me from leaving. I can't remember exactly what he said, but I moved him from in front of the door and I just left. When I got out, it had already been snowing all day and there wasn't a car on the road. I got about half a mile from my apartment, and after that, I have absolutely no clue what happened. I woke up the next morning in my basement on the cold concrete floor, and again, I just don't remember anything from that night. I actually saw him again after I had met my husband, and he angrily stomped up to me and said, "I thought that you were gay," and I was really scared of guys. I must have told him that I was gay or something, I don't know, but I'm 39 and I still think about this situation from time to time, and I often wonder, what the heck happened that night? What I do know is that I was probably roofied, but what I don't know is how the heck did I end up on that concrete floor? A few years ago, I, a 19-year-old female at the time, used to live in apartments across the street from a grocery store. I worked nights and needed to get a few groceries after work in the AM at one point, and if I didn't need many things, I would just walk instead of drive. But this was one such occasion. So, it was early enough, I'd say maybe 8 AM-ish. I'm browsing the store. I grabbed a really nice measuring cup, I think. Sort of like an impulse buy, I guess. But this will be important later on, too. Toward the end of my shopping, I'm grabbing the last few items, and I passed this same man at least twice. It could have been more before I started to notice, but he would pass me and dip into the aisle right behind the aisle that I would go in. The last thing I needed was milk, which was at the back of the store. Again, I passed this guy. On my way to the checkout stands, I decided not to get the measuring cup. Here comes this guy again, going into the aisle right behind the aisle that I went in. The measuring cup was at the front of the aisle, and I was there no more than 10 seconds, I would guess, before I was out of the aisle going to the checkout stands, and the guy was out of his aisle and passed me again. I continued on to the self-checkouts that were currently full, so I stood in line. And you know how people talk about, like, gut feelings? Well, I suddenly just feel extremely sick, like I was going to vomit and even got a cold sweat. I turned around and saw that same guy right behind me. His basket looked empty or only had a couple of things. I was too panicked to really count, but people were lined up behind me and my self-checkout became available. I glanced at my shopping basket and very audibly said, "Oh, shoot," like I forgot something, and I went off back into the store in a hurry. I'm pretty sure that it would have been out of place for him to suddenly follow me, but I don't know exactly what he did. I didn't look back. I circled around the entire store and came back to the checkout lines that were empty now. I quickly scanned all of my items and I rushed out of the store among the small crowd of the other shoppers. And that was when I saw a brown panelled van parked near the entrance. I'm almost 100% sure that I saw the same guy sitting in the front seat too, but I could have just been paranoid, I know. He was looking down and I'm guessing at a phone, but I ducked behind a different parked car and almost sprinted back to my apartment. I was definitely being followed that day, and the fact that he was sitting right there at the entrance, in a van of all things, I don't know, something just didn't feel right. To this day, that is the most intense gut feeling that I've ever had, and to be honest, I'm really glad that I listened to it. This happened about 5 years ago. I lived in an apartment at the time and worked at night, and when I got home, there was no available parking spots. So as a last resort, I parked across the street in like a small business plaza. This plaza has about 3 small businesses inside, I would guess. But after parking, I went home and played some games and watched some TV shows for a couple of hours. Then started doing my routine to get ready for sleep. And that's when I realized I forgot my inhaler in the car. I have mild asthma. So I walked to my car in that small business plaza around 3 in the morning. After grabbing my inhaler, I walked towards the end of the plaza when I noticed an object to my right, but didn't see what it was because it was too dark. Right at that moment, I heard a sound to my left, and out of nowhere, from the bushes, a tall man came out and literally power walked right past me. He walked like just 3 feet away from me, and then he went into the bushes to the right. I went home thinking, what the heck was that about? The next morning, though, I go to my car to move it out of the plaza, and that's when I realized that that small object that I saw that I couldn't make out in the dark was actually the head of a cat. It was placed purposefully because the head was upright. There was no blood and the body was nowhere in sight, but just seeing that reminded me of that weird dude that popped out from the bushes the previous night. This happened when I was only about maybe 8 or 9. My father and I went to Duke's Farm in New Jersey for a Cub Scout event, and after the event, we walked around the estate with a friend and his father. We were walking by the stables, and there was this mansion, now removed, behind these gates. We all decided that it would be fun to see what it was all about, so we went past the gates. But I started getting this, anxious feeling when we entered the gates. I presumed, though, that it was from entering a restricted area and not wanting to break the rules. As we got closer to this mansion, I get this horrifying feeling of terror and start crying and begging my dad to leave. At the time, I didn't know why this was happening and was scared for my life all of a sudden. But years later, my father tells me his experience from that day, and according to him, he froze in fear as well. He described it as evil entering him and apparently told the evil that I'm a follower of God and he will protect me. He was scared as well, but not as worried as me. But he felt this sensation like something was trying to take control. We got out of there as quickly as we could and kind of brushed off the experience, to be honest. And he didn't want to tell me until maybe a few years ago because he didn't want to scare me as a kid. Now, I've never been crazy into religion, and I'm very skeptical when it comes to paranormal experiences like this. But this experience was, just so real to me, and sort of opened my eyes to what might be out there. And with my dad, who I've never really known to be a liar or anything, confirming these feelings with the way that he did, I think that there was something going on at that place. Something evil. So I'm now 36 and I'm married. I live in another state, but we've been together for 10 years and have had a dog for 9 of those 10 years. When this last experience happened to me, I was around 19 to 20 years old and living in my parents' house. It was our second house that we lived in as a family, and it was only a few years after we moved in did I experience this. I'm not religious or someone who believes in the afterlife, but I also acknowledge phenomenon that we can't explain in energy that surrounds us. So the first time I remember experiencing anything strange or paranormal, I was about 7 years old. At the time, I had really bad asthma, so we thought that it actually turned out to be mold or asbestos in the school that I was at. I was on a bunch of medications as I stopped breathing a few times from my condition. Since leaving that school, I was never diagnosed with asthma or any medication whatsoever. But our first house was my parents' first house they purchased and I was born in. They bought it from a couple who was going through a divorce, I think, and it was one level and my bedroom was diagonally across from my parents' room. All of a sudden one night too, after my mum put me to bed, she would leave my door slightly open so I was able to see in the hall in my parents' bedroom. I would be laying in the bed, looking into their room, and within moments, the pitch-black room would start changing to all different colors rapidly and then would settle, and from it, the figure or outline of a man in all black. I couldn't see his facial features or clothes. I just knew that it was a man, and all black would form from these colors and slowly start walking towards the threshold of my room. The first time that this happened, obviously I freaked out and was screaming for my parents. They would always come and nothing would be there. This went on for about a year, in fact, and the most I ever watched was one time I didn't look away as the figure actually stepped into my room. But then I got so scared I would go under the covers and face my wall. I slept like that for a year until my mum took me to some woman that I don't know. She might have been a medium or a psychologist or something, and she had me draw the figure on a piece of paper in jail and put in a shoebox in my room and keep it there. Shortly after being out of that school and doing that, all of these things stopped happening to me, and I ended up being in that room and house another 7 years until we moved. I never had another experience after that. I never even really thought about that year again, my whole life really growing up until I was about 19. But we had just recently moved to another home, once again bought from a couple who had divorced. This house always had a a really weird sort of cold feeling to it. And one night I was out with friends just getting food. We weren't drinking or anything of that nature, just a low-key night. I remember I came home around 10 p.m. and went upstairs to my bedroom. My room was on the second floor, and in the middle of the floor my siblings' rooms were on either side of mine, and the master bathroom and bedroom at the end of the hall. And I remember I came home, played some video games for a bit, and then shut the lights off and laid down to go to sleep. It was a tiny room, and my bed was parallel to the door. I remember too that I fell asleep fast and hard. I don't remember the time or why even, but eventually I wake up facing the door. Slowly my eyes are adjusting to the darkness, and I see a figure standing in front of my closed door. I rub my eyes some more and see a tall black figure in what I can only describe as a generic striped prison clothes, standing there, and I instantly shot up in bed and go to scream, and all in that split second, the figure rushed towards me, put its hand around my throat, and chokes me. I can't scream or make a sound, and then instantly I wake up. I'm laying in bed facing the door sweating, and the room is completely empty. At this point, I'm kind of shook up. I go down the hall to the bathroom to splash some water on my face, and that was when I notice a handprint around my throat that does not match mine. Now, I don't know what to believe or think at this point. It was strange because I was shaken up, but not enough that it kept me up all night or anything. I didn't know what just happened or how to explain it, but I told myself that it was just a bad dream, and I went back to my room and went to sleep. I never really told anyone about this before, and nothing like that has ever happened to me since then, too. I've moved a bunch of times in my life. I collect antiques and vintage items, and I love horror films and anything paranormal or ghost hunting related. And still, I don't practice any spiritual or religious beliefs, so I really don't know what to think of this. But after reading up and listening to other people's stories more and more about the paranormal, it's something that has always interested me. I don't consider myself someone who is easily spooked. I felt at this point in my life that I would like to share these experiences here and see what people think, what their opinions on all of that might have been. To this day, I've never really personally ever come to a conclusion on what all of that was. I always just chalked up what happened to me when I was 7 as a combination of the medicines that I was taking and the mold or asbestos that I was inhaling while in that school. And then the event later in life, I guess I just rule out as sleep paralysis. I don't know. Any feedback, opinions, and insight is much appreciated, and yeah, I hope that it just never happens again. This happened to me recently. I was walking my dog, and we were walking down the street of the neighborhood that I live in. I heard an owl making a typical noise, and I walked further with my dog through the neighborhood with the owl, assumingly constantly moving with us, even though there were no real trees around. But I followed the sound further because I have a personal connection to owls. I just really like them. After many direction changes, I found myself down at the forest's edge. When I arrived there and I was standing before the dark entrance, the sound of the owl was now gone, and in place of it, a sort of creepy crawling noise could be heard, which was faster than it should have been, and it seemed to be coming in my direction, coming from deep inside the woods. Then I heard the owl again hooting from the direction that the strange, approaching crawling sounds were coming from. My dog became terrified at this point, and started threatening whatever was lurking in the darkness by barking at it. At this point, though, because the crawling became even faster and more unsettling, I sprinted backwards around 30 meters, and I turned around to see if something was behind me. And I heard the owl again, but this time it sounded different, as if someone was calling my name to come back. When I told my dog to calm down as I was running home, a distorted laughter was what I heard coming from the forest, and it didn't really sound human, but After that, I just ran for home and I locked all the doors as soon as I got there. It was nighttime at that point and I just tried to get some sleep, but I don't know what the heck that was. I, an 18-year-old female, met my ex, male, 22, in February of 2020, but didn't end up dating him until closer to my 17th birthday because he still lived with his girlfriend. He told me that they were just friends and he didn't like her like that, and I didn't find out until later that they were actually still doing things together, and meeting him was absolutely the biggest mistake of my life. Everything started off great though, as every relationship does. I sent pics because he was my boyfriend, so, and of course I let him save them for later use. Another big mistake. But I noticed that they were still texting, and when I went through his phone, he was saying that he still loved her and missed her. I was deeply hurt by that and called him out on it. He apologized and said that it would never happen again, and I told him to text her that we were dating, and he did. And she was ticked. She stopped paying for the house and helping him with car payments, and at this time he had quit Taco Bell and refused to do his new job Ubering because I need to practice League of Legends because I want to be a pro League streamer. So I worked my tail off and ended up losing my job because the manager didn't let me work without a doctor's note, so I was stuck working his job while he played his games. Before I met him, I had $4.5K in my savings. He ended up using my car to pay his phone bills, car payments, the apartment, daily weed, fast food, new league accounts, and CSGO knives of all things. But he kept losing his accounts due to telling people to off themselves and using all sorts of slurs, as you can probably imagine. But the worst was yet to happen. I found out that he was using an old tablet to excessively watch explicit material, set up dating accounts, and have different Instagram accounts. But on these accounts, he was pretending to be a woman. I called him out about this and told him that I wanted to leave. He freaks out, jumping around and screaming and crying, saying that he would change, and I trusted him. I know, stupid. But as time went on, things got worse, and I was scared to leave, and by the end of this, you'll see why. He had shoved me into a wall and getting in my face, screaming, "You stole my car key because you don't want me to work because you're jealous of other girls," which was stupid because he had thrown his car keys at me during a different argument. But one day I went through the iPad and found that he was actively not just sending, but selling my pictures from when I was 16 or 17, and doing the same with his other ex. I started to try and get my stuff together and put Gorilla Glue in the charging port to just get rid of the filth that I just saw. When he found out that he no longer charged after he used my card to get us food, he was absolutely livid. He started screaming and getting in my face. I tried to go around him and grab my things, but when my back was turned, he pulled me down to the ground, wrestled me till he was able to put me in a chokehold. I was sobbing and just accepted that this would be the end of me, but before I blacked out, he let me go and I started gasping for air and gagging from excessive coughing as he just stood and laughed at me. I tried to crawl away from him when he grabbed my leg and started dragging me out of the apartment. I kicked to try and get him off of me, which just made him pull me like a dog playing tug of war. But he eventually dragged me out, keeping my wallet, keys, and all of my valuables, so I sat crying, begging for my stuff so I could just go home. He came outside and pulled me down the apartment stairs by my leg, and I was left with extreme bruising and also some cuts. I did end up calling the police, obviously, and they did absolutely nothing in the end. Fast forward, and he had to move because he had nowhere to stay or live after getting evicted from the apartment, and I had gotten a new job at this point. One day, though, it was particularly cold, and I went to get a shirt out of my car, and there he was. He was sitting in my car, on his phone. I left the door unlocked usually because I worked in a good area. I called him a cheater and told him to leave, and he got out of the car and was starting to go around the back, so I jumped in and tried to lock the door from the back seat. He ran over and pulled the door open and started trying to pull me out of the car. I started screaming and kicking at him. Thankfully, a customer saw this happening and called the police. They arrested him and told me to go home for the night, which they ended up firing me for, unfortunately. Also, unfortunately, he got bailed out, and while he was in jail, he had given out my phone number to other people there. Then, he walked 4.5 hours to my house after he was released and was looking around my backyard when my neighbor saw him and called my dad. My dad got in his truck with his gun and waited for him to come out of the gas station. He eventually did, but ran off, and he wasn't shot. He had harassed me, saying that he was going to show up to my graduation and ruin everything, and has gotten to the point of making multiple fake accounts on Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok, pretending to be me and his other exes. And as of today, he still pretends to be high school girls selling out pictures and making fake accounts.